Rejected mate laughed at the Alpha King, unaware she was the last of her bloodline. The tray was heavier than usual, and Sarah Ashvale noticed it the way she noticed everything in the Iron Moon pack hall, quietly, and without making a production of it. She had been carrying trays since she was 14 years old. She knew the weight of empty glasses and the weight of full ones, the way her left shoulder dipped when the load shifted, the way her knees adjusted automatically to the slight uneven slope of the old stone floor near the east serving table. She knew that floor, the way you know something you have mopped twice a week for 8 consecutive years. She could have walked it in complete darkness without touching a wall. Tonight the hall was blazing. Lanterns hung from the ceiling brackets and from the iron stands along the walls, and the combined light of perhaps 200 flames turned the whole room amber and gold. The fire in the main hearth had been built 3 times its usual size. Every ranked wolf in the Iron Moon territory was present, and a significant number of visitors from neighboring packs had arrived as well, and the collective body heat of all of them had raised the room temperature by several degrees, so that the cold autumn night outside the thick stone walls felt like a different world entirely. Sarah moved through it all with her chin level and her eyes on the space between people, rather than on the people themselves. That was the trick she had learned early, and never stopped using. Looking at people meant they looked back. Looking back meant stopping, explaining, being pulled into something that would require her to put the tray down. Not looking meant moving. Moving meant the work got done. And the work getting done before 9 o'clock meant the pack steward had nothing to find fault with, which meant her meal allowance survived the week intact. She had been docked twice this month already. She could not afford a third. The annual bonding ceremony was the loudest and most crowded event the pack ran each year, and it had taken Sarah several years to understand that this made it, from her perspective, the most manageable. In a hall full of ranked wolves, dressed in their finest and competing for each other's attention, nobody was watching the girl with the tray. People who believed themselves to be the most important people in the room did not track the movements of serving staff. She had become, over years of practice, completely invisible in crowds, and she used that invisibility the same way other people used influence or wealth, as a tool, as protection, as a way of getting through the day intact. Tonight was different from past ceremonies, in one specific and significant way, and that difference had been the subject of every conversation Sarah had overheard for the past 14 days. Kael Voss was coming, the Alpha King, the single wolf who held formal authority over all 12 wolf territories on the continent, who had inherited that authority at 23 when his father died with startling speed, who had spent the 6 years since building a reputation for controlled, deliberate, unhurried power. He was 29 now. He was reported to be serious in a way that was not unfriendliness, but was also not warmth. The particular serious quality of someone who had been carrying something very large since before they were fully formed. He had not attended a pack ceremony in 4 years. His visits were usually conducted through formal representatives, and the fact that he was coming in person had sent the Iron Moon Pack Alpha, a wide, politically cautious man named Gordon Fell, into a controlled panic that had lasted the better part of 2 weeks and filtered down through every rank in the pack until it reached Sarah, in the form of 3 extra cleaning shifts and a formal speech from the pack steward about the standards of presentation expected in the presence of visiting royalty. She had nodded. She had taken the extra shifts. She had polished the serving trays until she could see her own face in them, a face with steady brown eyes and the careful, neutral expression of someone who had long since learned not to let the things she was feeling move across it. She carried the tray toward the east serving table. She heard the front doors open behind her. She heard the crowd react before she heard anything else. A collective inhale, a held breath, a silence that dropped through the noise of the hall the way a stone drops through water, fast and complete. She did not look. She had been through this enough times to know that looking was not her role in this moment. Her role was to keep moving. The glasses needed to reach the table. She was 4 steps from the table when she turned left to avoid the cluster of young ranked wolves who planted themselves in the middle of the floor at every ceremony and had been doing so for as long as she could remember and would continue doing so until someone with actual standing told them to move, which no one ever did, because they were all the sons and daughters of senior wolves, and therefore untouchable in the particular way of people who know their position protects them. She turned left and walked directly into a wall. The wall was not a wall. It was a person, and the person moved slightly on impact, the way people move when something runs into them from an unexpected direction, and Sarah had time to register the dark formal cloak with the silver thread border, before the tray was already going, and she was already reaching for it, and not reaching it in time. 6 full glasses of wine found gravity. They found the cloak. The sound was the sound of an accident, in a room that had just gone completely quiet, which meant it was very loud indeed. Glass on stone, liquid on fabric. The particular silence that follows something irreversible happening in front of an audience that has no script for what comes next. Sarah stood with the empty tray in both hands. She looked at the spreading dark stain on the pale silver embroidery of the cloak in front of her. She did not move for 1 full second. Then she raised her eyes. He was taller than she had constructed him in the 2 weeks of overheard descriptions. Not just physically, though he was tall, but in the sense of presence that some people carried, the quality of a person whose attention, when directed at you, felt like a weight and a light at the same time. His face was composed of sharp angles and dark eyes, and a stillness that she recognized immediately as the particular stillness of someone making a decision, not reacting, deciding. Something had happened, and the decision about what it meant and what the response would be was being made right now, in real time, behind those dark eyes. She opened her mouth to apologize. She did not get the word out, because in the moment her eyes met his, something happened inside her chest that had no language she had ever been taught. It moved. That was the only word she had for it. It moved, deep in her sternum, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there, like a sound suddenly audible that had been present at a frequency just below hearing. It went through her from the center outward, and her wolf, which had been silent and muffled and distant behind what felt like a closed door since she was 14 years old, came rushing forward with an urgency that nearly took her off her feet. Not in fear, in recognition. The bond formed between one breath and the next. She knew what it was. Every wolf knew what it was from childhood. The mate bond. The thing the old stories described in language that always seemed too large for what was being described, until you felt it, and then the language did not seem large enough at all. She had filed it long ago under things that happened to other people. She was an omega with a broken shift and a faded rank mark. She had no illusions about what category of experience was available to her. And yet, she could see, in the fraction of a second before his expression sealed itself back into control, that it was happening to him too. Something moved behind his dark eyes. Recognition, fast and unwilled. Then something more complicated. Then the particular quality of a very intelligent person making a very fast calculation. Then he spoke. His voice was even, controlled. He did not need volume. The hall was already silent. "I reject you," he said. 500 wolves heard it. She felt the bond crack, the warmth that had arrived 2 seconds ago, that had felt like the first deep breath after a long time underwater, split down the middle, the way dry wood splits when the force hits exactly right. Clean and complete, and irreversible. The two halves did not go anywhere. They sat in her chest, which was considerably worse than if they had simply vanished. The silence in the hall had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people who had stopped in surprise. It was the silence of 500 people, holding very still, because something had happened that none of them had a framework for, and they were all waiting, collectively, to find out what came next. All of them were looking at her. Sarah looked at Cale Voss. She held his gaze for a long moment. The broken pieces of the bond sat in her chest, and she was not going to pretend they were not there, because she was not a person who pretended. She felt what she felt. She would feel the hollow of this for a long time, and she knew that with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had always been honest with herself about the way things were, that hollow had been made, it would remain. And then, from somewhere she could not have predicted or explained, she laughed. It was not a performance. It was not calculated defiance staged for an audience of 500. It was simply the sound her body chose to produce when handed something that was both genuinely unbearable and, from some angle she could not yet fully articulate, faintly and absurdly consistent with everything that had come before it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was quiet by most standards, but the hall was absolutely silent, and in that silence, 2 seconds of quiet laughter was the loudest thing she had ever done in her life. She watched something move behind his eyes that she did not have a name for. She set the empty tray down on the nearest surface. She took a breath. She straightened her back to its full height. She looked at Cale Voss one more time, directly and without hurry, and then she turned and walked toward the servant's door at the left side of the hall. Her hands were steady. Her chin was level. Her feet knew the floor they had mopped for 8 years, and did not stumble. She reached the door, and went through it, and let it close behind her. She did not look back. The corridor on the other side was cold and dim, and empty of people. She stood against the stone wall with her back pressed flat against it, and breathed. In through the nose, measured and deliberate. Out through the mouth. The cold air of the corridor was sharp and real, and entirely present, and she focused on it. On the stone wall at her back. On the sound of her own breathing, which was steady. The sounds from the hall on the other side of the door were muffled. Someone had begun speaking in there. Gordon fell most likely, recovering the ceremony from its disruption, with the practiced voice of a man who had been managing difficult situations in front of crowds for 20 years. She counted to 30. Then she went and got the mop. She worked until midnight. She mopped the entry corridor, and the outer receiving hall, and the passage between the kitchen and the main room. She reorganized the serving station by the east wall. She collected the scattered glasses from where they had rolled under the nearest table, and washed them in the kitchen sink, and dried them and put them away. Nobody spoke to her. This was not unusual. She was accustomed to nobody speaking to her during the working hours. She did the work, and she kept the broken pieces in her chest at a distance, by keeping her hands moving, and her feet moving, and her mind on the task immediately in front of her, which had always been her best method for getting through things. At midnight, she put the mop away, and walked to her room. Her room was small, adjacent to the pack kitchens, not much larger than the storage closet it had originally been, before the previous head cook had cleared it out, and given it to her when she was 16, and the alternative was a shared dormitory room, where she was not welcome. She knew every crack in the ceiling, and every draft from the window that faced the kitchen yard. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she let herself feel it for 5 minutes. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes, which was the method she had developed over years for hard things. Not suppression, because suppression was a loan you paid back later with interest. Not wallowing, because wallowing had never gotten anything done. 5 minutes of feeling it fully, directly, without looking away from any of it. The bond, the 2 seconds of it, the warmth that had been the best thing she had ever felt. The crack, the hollow where it had been. She felt all of it without flinching. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was still. And being still, she had learned over 22 years, was sometimes the closest available thing to rest. In the morning, the pack steward knocked on her door at 7:30, with 2 guards flanking him and a cardboard box in his hands, and told her, without meeting her eyes, that her services were no longer required by Iron Moon. She had 1 hour to collect her belongings. The box was for anything that would not fit in her bag. She looked at the box for a moment, then she took it. She packed in 32 minutes. She was efficient. She owned very little. 1 set of clothing for each season, which was exactly all she had. The small kitchen knife that the previous head cook had pressed into her hand 4 years ago when he was leaving, and said was hers because he had no one else to give it to. A book left behind by a pack member who had departed suddenly 3 years ago, and whose family had never come to retrieve her things. A worn blanket that she had mended twice along one edge, with whatever thread had been available at the time, which meant the repairs were in 3 different colors, and the blanket looked like a project someone had started, and then reconsidered. The box was not needed. Everything fit in the bag. She left the box by the door. She did not say goodbye to anyone, because there was genuinely no one in Iron Moon to say it to. She had been a function in this pack, not a presence. She had cleaned floors and carried trays, and made herself useful and small and forgettable, and the pack had used those functions and returned nothing in the form of connection, which had always been, if not acceptable, at least survivable. Functions did not say goodbye when removed. They were simply gone. She walked out through the side gate at 8:23 in the morning, with her bag over her left shoulder, and the broken thing in her chest, and the thin autumn sun on her face. The road south ran through open scrubland toward the border zones, and Sarah walked it. She had thought about Duskfield from time to time over the past 3 years, since the traveling herb supplier had mentioned it in passing while waiting for the kitchen to fill his order. A border town, he had said, not with any particular interest, just as a geographical observation. Between 3 territories, belongs to none of them, technically. Gets people who don't fit the system elsewhere. She had filed it away, not knowing why, not examining why. She knew why now. She walked steadily. She had good feet for walking, flat and practical, built for long hours on stone floors. The first day she covered a considerable distance on the clear, dry road. She stopped twice at streams to refill her water flask. She ate the bread she had made with her own hands the morning before the ceremony, which she had packed in her bag the night before, as if some part of her had known what the morning after would bring, or had simply been practical enough not to assume anything about what the morning after would bring. She thought about the bond while she walked. She was not the kind of person who avoided difficult things. She had tried that once, when she was 15, and learned that avoided things did not shrink with distance. They waited. So she took the bond out and looked at it while she walked, the way you examine something that has injured you, not obsessively, not to cause more pain, but to understand the exact shape and nature of the injury, so you know what you are working with. She had felt the bond for perhaps 2 seconds. Less. She had felt what it could have been, the potential of it, the complete and unbidden rightness of it, and then she had felt the crack. And now she was on a road going south with that crack, somewhere below her sternum, and the knowledge that it would be there for a long time. This was survivable. She had survived many things. She also thought, walking, about the laugh. She was not entirely certain she understood it. It had not been performed, and it had not been cruel, and it had not been, she did not think, the sound of someone who was not hurt. It had been something else. Something close to the sound a person makes when a very long pattern suddenly becomes visible in its entirety all at once. She had been told, in 100 ways over 22 years, that she was surplus to requirements, that she took up space she was not entitled to, that whatever she was, and whatever she brought, it was not enough, and not welcome. And when the most powerful man on the continent looked at her and said those words in front of everyone who mattered to the only world she had ever known, some part of her had recognized the pattern so completely, and with such perfect clarity, that its recognition had come out as sound. She was not certain that was healthy. She was also not certain she had the resources right now to evaluate whether it was healthy. That was a question for later, for when she had somewhere to sleep and a means of feeding herself and enough distance from the ceremony that it was a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was still happening. She slept one night under a wide oak tree whose roots had made a kind of cradle in the earth on the downhill side of the road. She used her bag as a pillow. The night was cold but dry, and she pulled her blanket around her and looked at the stars, which were very clear at this distance from any settlement, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill that had taken years to develop, and which she considered one of her more useful ones. In the morning she walked. By the second afternoon, Duskfield appeared on the horizon, low buildings and a water tower, and the particular kind of practical, unpretentious architecture that develops in places built for use rather than impression. She walked down the main street and felt the particular quality of a place that was not watching her, not looking through her the way Iron Moon had looked through her, simply not watching, because everyone here had their own weight to carry, and had learned not to audit the weight of strangers. She felt her shoulders drop slightly, without deciding to let them drop. She saw the herb shop. It sat between the bakery and the boot repair, with dried plants hanging in its windows, and a small sign that said only, Marin's. She could smell, even from the street, something she did not have an immediate name for, but that made her feel less cold than she had been feeling. She pushed the door open. The woman behind the counter was old in the way of someone who had earned their age through specific and sustained experience, small and sharp-featured with white hair pinned back without ceremony, and glasses so thick the lenses doubled the size of her eyes. She was reading. She did not look up immediately. "You need work," the woman said, without looking up from the page. Sarah stopped. "I was going to ask if you knew anyone in town who was hiring." "I do." The woman closed the book and removed the glasses. Her eyes without them were sharp in a way the lenses had managed to partially conceal. She looked at Sarah, the way some people read maps, for information, for the shape of the terrain, not for judgment. "Can you sort herbs without mixing the ones that look similar?" "Yes." "Can you make accurate change without a written tally?" "Yes." "Do you have questions about why I am willing to offer work to a stranger in under a minute?" Sarah considered this. Not yet, she said. The corner of the old woman's mouth moved. Correct answer. The ones who ask too many questions before they start very rarely last. My name is Marin. You sleep in the back room. Pay is meals, and a small weekly amount. It is not generous. It is more than I had this morning, Sarah said. She moved in that afternoon, and the pattern of the work established itself within the first 2 days, and did not need discussion, because it was the pattern of two practical people who understood what the job required, and simply did it. In the evenings, Marin read by the front lamp, and Sarah sorted the next day's supplies in the back room, and sometimes they drank tea together without much talking, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had ended up at the edge of things and found, perhaps surprisingly, that the edge suited them. The pack did not send a formal notice. They never did anything formally where Sarah was concerned. The pack steward came to her door the morning after the ceremony with 2 guards and an empty box, and told her, in the same flat tone he used for every administrative matter, that her services were no longer required. She had 1 hour. She packed in 32 minutes. The road south from Iron Moon ran through 3 hours of open terrain, before the landscape shifted to the scrubland of the border zones, and Sarah walked all of it without stopping, except twice at streams to refill her flask. She had good feet for walking. 8 years on stone floors had built them that way, flat and steady, and comfortable with long hours of movement. The autumn weather was gray but dry. The road was clear. She had made it to Duskfield 2 days later, and been hired by Marin within a minute of walking through the shop door, and she had spent the following 6 weeks learning the rhythms of a town that existed for people who had stopped fitting anywhere else. Owen at the boot repair, large and quiet, Wolfmark as faded as hers. Carla at the bakery, young and loud and generous with the surplus rolls on Thursday afternoons. Renard, older, passing through on his private route twice a week. The human families who kept their curtains slightly more drawn than in other towns, because they had chosen proximity to wolf life over the ignorance of distance, and had made a quiet peace with that choice. The suppliers who came from 3 different territories and spoke 3 different regional accents and exchanged news with the particular detachment of people who moved between worlds. She had found that she fit here the way she had not fit anywhere in 22 years, not because anyone particularly wanted her, but because nobody particularly didn't, either. Duskfield did not sort people by rank and function. It sorted people by whether they could carry their own weight and leave others to carry theirs. And that was a sorting system she had been meeting the requirements of her entire life, without ever being given credit for it. The hollow in her chest did not go away. She had not expected it to, not quickly. A mate bond, even a broken one, even 2 seconds old, left its mark. She carried it the way she carried the blanket she had mended, in 3 different colors of thread, because it was hers, and because there was nothing to be done about it, and because pretending it wasn't there had never helped anything. She also noticed, beginning in her 2nd week at Marin's, that the old woman watched her. Not constantly, not obtrusively, but those sharp eyes tracked to her hands sometimes, and specifically to the sleeve she had begun pulling down over her right wrist, without any particular conscious decision to do so. The skin of her right wrist had begun doing something she could not explain, and was not ready to try. A faint warmth that was not fever, a pulse that did not match her heartbeat. In the complete dark of the back room with the lamp extinguished, if she lay very still and let her eyes adjust, she could see the faintest silver light from under the fabric of her sleeve. She had told no one. She did not intend to tell anyone until she understood it, and she did not understand it yet. She noticed Marin watching. She filed it. She said nothing. 140 miles north, in the palace that sat on its hill above the capital city, Cale Voss sat at his desk at 20 minutes past midnight and held a document he had been attempting to read for 43 minutes without success. It was not a complicated document. Border Patrol assessments from the Eastern Line, straightforward, the kind of thing he processed before breakfast on most mornings, without spending more than 10 minutes on it. Tonight the words arrived at his eyes and dissolved before they reached the part of his mind that made meaning from them. He would find himself at the end of a sentence with no memory of what the sentence had contained. He would start again. Same result. He set it down. He pressed the backs of his fingers against his closed eyes and breathed with the care of someone managing something difficult. This was not the first night. This had been happening for 3 weeks, since the ceremony, since the hall. since the moment he had stood in front of 500 wolves, with wine cooling on his cloak, and made the fastest and most consequential calculation of his adult life. He had calculated risk. He had calculated optics. He had calculated the 6 months of management that would follow if he acknowledged a mate bond in that hall with that audience, with a girl whose rank was the lowest registered in the pack, whose shift was broken, whose standing was nothing, whose name meant nothing. He had calculated all of it in 3 seconds and spoken. He had not calculated what it would cost him. The alpha sight was the function he had relied on most consistently since coronation. Not the obvious things, the strength and the speed and the authority that came with his rank, but the sight, the deep awareness that allowed him to feel the health and stability of all 12 territories simultaneously, the way you feel the temperature of a room you are standing in. He could feel his wolves, not individually, not by name, but as collective presence, as the sense of a living thing, and that sense had always been clear. For 3 weeks, the Northern Territory had been dimming, not gone. He could still feel it at the edges, but the clarity was wrong. It was like hearing a voice through a wall, knowing someone was speaking, unable to hear what they were saying, and the wall had been getting thicker. He had told no one. He could not tell anyone until he understood what was happening, and he had 3 weeks of sleepless nights, and 1 exhausted archived review to show for his attempts at understanding, which was not enough. A knock at the study door. He knew the knock. Rylan, 4th attempt tonight. Come in, he said. Rylan entered with the particular economy of a man who had been waiting for this invitation for 2 hours, and was not going to spend any of his capital on preamble. He read the room in 3 seconds, the way he read everything, and said, "The northern site." Yes. How long? Measurably declining for 3 weeks, significantly reduced for the last 10 days. Cale paused. He considered the version of this where he continued to manage alone. He considered it for approximately 5 seconds, and discarded it. I could feel 3 territories clearly at the start of the month. I can feel 2 with any confidence now. The northern line is nearly dark to me. Rylan was still. He was the kind of person whose alarm expressed itself as stillness rather than movement, which was one of the reasons Cale had kept him close for 6 years. Alarm that expressed as stillness was alarm you could work with. That is not a small loss, he said. No. And you believe it is connected to the ceremony? It was not a question. Cale answered it as a statement. I believe it is connected to the ceremony. Rylan was quiet for a measured moment. Then we need to find her. That was my conclusion also, Cale said. I need you to go. Quietly. No formal record of the search. Find where she went after Iron Moon removed her. How much time do I have? As little as possible, Cale said. The Northern Territory cannot go dark entirely. The pack bond there is already reporting instability at the border seams. If the alphas up there lose their connection to the central line, the management problem becomes a territorial crisis. He paused. 2 people you trust. Whatever resources you need. A week at most. Rylan nodded. He was already turning toward the door. And Rylan, Cale said. Rylan stopped. She may not want to come, Cale said. His voice was even. He had practiced evenness. She may have every reason not to want to come. Do not compel her. Find her. Assess the situation, send word, and then I will go myself. Rylan looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man who was noting something and choosing to note it silently. Understood, he said. He left. Cale turned back to the window. The capital city lay below the palace hill, 100,000 lights in the dark, 100,000 people sleeping under rooftops that had no idea the man responsible for the stability of their world was standing at a window, unable to read a document, and unable to sleep, and becoming less able, day by day, to feel the territory that surrounded them. He picked up the document. He read the first sentence. He reached the end of it. He had no idea what it said. He set it down face first on the desk, which was what you did with things you were going to try again in the morning, and he went to bed. He lay in the dark and breathed and felt the particular quality of the silence where the Northern Territory used to be and should have been and was not anymore, not clearly, not in the way it had always been. And in the back room of a herb shop 140 miles south, a woman with a faded rank mark lay in a different dark and breathed at the same measured pace, not sleeping, not quite, the ghost of the bond, doing the only thing it could from that distance, and at that fracture, which was to keep them both, without their knowing or choosing it, distantly and persistently aware of each other. It was not comfort. It was not enough to be comfort. It was simply the fact of the matter, the way the tide is a fact, and the direction of rivers is a fact, and they both lay in their separate darks and breathed, and eventually both of them slept. The first vision came 18 days after Sarah arrived in Duskfield, on a Thursday afternoon when the shop was quiet and she was in the back room tying dried lavender into bundles for the weekend market display. She was not doing anything unusual. Her hands were occupied with the lavender and the twine, her mind running its own quiet background current the way it did during repetitive work, and she was present and entirely herself, and then she was somewhere else. Not physically. She did not move. The lavender was still in her hands when she came back, but in the space between one breath and the next, she had been somewhere that was not the back room of Marin's herb shop, and she had been there completely. A forest. Trees tall and pale, their trunks birch-colored, but with a faint metallic quality, a sheen that existed in the bark itself, rather than arriving from any outside light source. The ground was dark soil, covered in white moss, so deep, it felt like standing on something breathing. The air held a scent she had no existing category for, something between rain and iron and something older than both, something alive in the way that very old living things are alive, slowly, and with great certainty. She stood in the silver forest, and looked around, and did not move her feet, and was not afraid. That was the notable thing. She had expected fear, and it did not come. What came instead was a feeling she turned over carefully afterward, looking for the right word, and the closest she found was recognition. She recognized this place. She had never been here in any form she could account for. She recognized it anyway. Then a voice came from among the trees. It was speaking a language she did not know. The sounds of it were nothing like any language she had heard, or heard of. They arrived around her like water, surrounding her without pressure. She could not decode them. But the meaning came through in the way that temperature comes through a closed window, not as translated words but as understanding, arriving directly in her body before it passed through her mind. She understood, in this wordless way, that the voice was speaking about time, about something that had been waiting, about something that was beginning to wake, about her specifically. Then she was back in the back room with the lavender in her hands, and her hands shaking slightly. She set the lavender down. She looked at the back of her left hand, at the faded rank mark she had spent 22 years looking at, and finding unremarkable. It was pulsing. A slow, steady rhythm entirely distinct from her heartbeat. A light that was barely visible in the afternoon light through the small window but was there. She watched it pulse for 30 seconds. Then it faded. The mark returned to its usual defeated appearance, barely visible, easily dismissed. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up the lavender and finished the bundles. She did not tell Marin. She was not ready to tell Marin, because she had no framework for what had happened, and she was not the kind of person who described things she did not yet understand. She watched the mark on her left hand for the next few days, and it did nothing further, and she filed the vision away in the part of herself where she put things that needed time before they could be addressed. 9 days later the second vision came. Same forest, same voice, the meaning arriving in the same wordless way, more urgent this time. Something running out. Not time exactly, but a kind of opportunity. A window that had been open for a long time, and was now beginning to close. She came back from it, and reorganized the back shelf, and brought out the afternoon deliveries, and said nothing to anyone. The third vision came on a Sunday night, waking her from sleep, and this one was different. She was already moving in the silver forest when it began, her feet following a path she had not chosen, and the path led through the pale trees, toward a clearing at the center of the forest, where the largest tree she had ever imagined stood, its trunk wider than 3 arm spans, its bark silver bright rather than silver pale, and carved into it, at exactly eye level, was a marking she recognized before she had finished processing what she was looking at. A crescent moon. Inside the crescent, a symbol. The same symbol that had been on the back of her left hand since birth, worn and faded and almost invisible, but the same. She woke up with her right wrist blazing silver light in the dark of the back room. She stared at her wrist. The light was real and present and strong enough to illuminate the wall beside the cot. She pressed her other hand over it. The light came through her fingers. She pulled her sleeve down. The light came through the fabric. She lay in the dark, and breathed, and waited, and after approximately 3 minutes, the light dimmed to the faint warmth she had been feeling for weeks, present, and pulsing, but no longer blazing. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, and thought about all the things she had been filing away and not addressing, and she understood that the filing was coming to an end. In the morning she made tea. She brought Marin her cup. She began the opening work. And that afternoon, a knock came at the back door. Not the front. Deliveries used the front. The back was for things that did not want to be observed. She opened it. The man on the other side was built for not being noticed. Medium everything. Road clothes. The stillness of someone trained to take up minimal space. He looked at her with the directness of a person who had been looking for someone and had found them and was not going to perform the pretense of casual encounter. "I am looking for Sarah Ashvale," he said. "You have found her," she said. "Who are you?" "My name is Rylan. I serve the Alpha King." He said it plainly, without the formality that some people used around the title, as if the title itself was a form of protection. "I am not here to compel you to anything. He wants to know you are safe." She looked at him for a moment. She was reading his face the way Marin had read hers on the first day, for information rather than judgment, and what she found there was someone telling the truth about his purpose, which did not mean there were no complications, but did mean the stated purpose was real. "Come in," she said. "I will make tea." He came in and sat at the backroom table and told her what was happening. He was precise and thorough and did not dramatize. The sight loss, the failed sleep, the 3 territories, and then 2, and the northern line, going nearly dark. The mate bond reversal, what the historical record suggested about what happened when a true bond was rejected, and how the rejection fed back into the person who made it. He laid it out like a report, which she suspected was exactly what it was. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much time does he have?" she asked, "before it goes entirely?" "I cannot tell you exactly," Rylan said. "The rate of decline has been accelerating. Several weeks, possibly. Perhaps less." She thought about this. She thought about 12 territories and the wolves living in them, who had nothing to do with her, and nothing to do with the ceremony, and who would feel the consequences of the sight failing, before they understood what they were feeling. She thought about the pulsing mark on her left hand, and the blazing light on her right wrist, and the silver forest, and the voice in a language she did not yet know. "I need 3 days before I go anywhere," she said. He blinked. 3 days. "I need to speak with Marin," she said. "There are things I do not yet know that I need to know before I walk into a situation I do not fully understand. I am not hiding, and I am not refusing. I am being practical about preparation." She met his eyes directly. "Can you give me 3 days?" He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that rearranged itself slightly, in a direction she read as respect for the answer, rather than frustration with it. 3 days, he said. "I will be at the inn on the East Road." He left. She went to find Marin, who was in the front room, and had known about the knock at the back door, and had not come out, which told Sarah something significant about how much the old woman already knew. Marin set her book down before Sarah spoke. She reached behind the reading chair and brought out the book that Sarah had been feeling in the room for weeks without being able to see. She put it on the table between them. "Sit down," she said. Sarah sat. She looked at the book. Old leather, dark with years of handling. When Marin opened it, she saw 2 kinds of writing. A dense, careful script in the margins that she could not read, and a clearer hand in the main body that she could. Names and dates and marks drawn with precision. A lineage tree, generations deep. At the bottom, circled twice, in the clearest hand on the page, her own name. "Your mother," Marin said, "was named Alara." And she began to speak, and Sarah listened, and the world Sarah had understood herself to exist in shifted on its foundations and became something larger and stranger and, despite everything, more coherent than it had been before. Marin talked for a long time, and Sarah let her. She had learned early in her life that the most useful thing you could do when someone had something significant to tell you was to stay entirely quiet and let them tell it without interruption, because interruptions broke the thread of things, and broken threads were harder to follow to their ends. So she sat across the table from Marin, with the lineage book open between them and her hands folded in her lap, and she listened. "The Ashvale bloodline," Marin said, was old. Older than the current pack structure. Older than the territorial divisions. Older than the administrative systems that had grown up to manage the wolf populations across the continent over the past few centuries. It traced back to what the oldest records called the First Age, a period before packs existed in their current organized form, when wolves lived in smaller and more fluid groups, and the relationship between their nature and the land was less mediated by rank structure and political alliance. In that earlier time, certain wolves carried something different, not more power in the conventional sense of the word, something more like a function, a particular relationship with what the old texts called the root system of the world, the deep and invisible network that the living energy of the land ran through. Every pack, every wolf bond, every alpha authority, existed above this network the way a forest exists above its root system, drawing from it without consciously knowing what it was drawing from. The network was the foundation, and certain wolves, in certain bloodlines, were the anchor of it. The Ashvale bloodline was the last of those bloodlines. The others had faded over centuries, for reasons the records traced, with the careful sadness of historians, documenting a loss that could not be undone. Disease, isolation, the gradual separation from the old ways, as the pack system formalized, and the ancient knowledge became the province of fewer and fewer keepers. But the Ashvale bloodline had survived, generation by generation, carrying what it carried, doing what it did, which was to be present in the world, and to keep the root network functioning the way a deep taproot keeps the soil from washing away in heavy rain. Then the Voss dynasty had hunted them. Marin said this plainly, without softening it, because the truth of it was not softened by anything, and she was not the kind of woman who put comfortable coatings on things that were what they were. The hunting had begun 3 centuries ago, when the founder of the current Voss dynasty had encountered an Ashvale wolf and recognized something in her that frightened him. Not her power specifically, the fact of a power he could not fully see, could not fully understand, could not fully control. A power that existed in the world alongside his authority, without requiring his authority's permission. Afraid people with resources do terrible things. He had done terrible things. His son after him. His granddaughter after that. It had taken 3 generations to reduce a bloodline that had numbered perhaps 30 wolves to 2. Alara, who was Sarah's mother, and her brother, who had not survived the last organized hunt. After that, only Alara. And then Alara had understood what she needed to do. She had not died of pack sickness. Marin said this with the directness of someone who had been carrying a truth for a long time, and was relieved to be setting it down. Alara had gone into hiding, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who understood exactly why she was hunted, and what it would cost the world if she was found and removed from it. She had arranged for Sarah to be placed in Iron Moon under a false identity, with a suppression placed on her power, and her rank, and her wolf, that was strong enough, and well-designed enough, that it had held for 22 years. The broken shift was not broken. It was locked. A wolf that could not fully shift could not be read by pack sight in the usual way. An omega rank that could not be traced above a certain level. An identity stripped of any family connection that would flag a search. Alara had done this the way she had apparently done everything, with precision and thoroughness, and the particular love of a parent who understood that the safest thing for her child was to become invisible to the systems that were looking for them. She had then disappeared. Marin did not know with certainty what had become of her. She had received no word in 30 years. She had concluded, not hopefully but practically, that Alara was likely gone, which meant Sarah was alone, the last one. Marin closed the lineage book and looked at Sarah across the table with the careful, direct look of a woman who had been watching this person for 6 weeks and had formed an accurate assessment of her capacity to receive difficult information without fracturing. "The mark on your right wrist," Marin said. "That is not a mark that was placed on you. That is the original mark, the one your bloodline has always carried, the Ashvale mark. It was suppressed by your mother's working the same way your shift was suppressed. What you have been feeling over the past weeks, the warmth and the light, is the suppression breaking down. Because of the ceremony," Sarah said. "The mate bond, even incomplete, even severed, touched something real in you," Marin said. "Something that the suppression was resting on top of. When the bond cracked, the suppression cracked with it. Not all at once. But it has been coming down ever since." "The visions," Sarah said. "The ley line root system," Marin said. The network your bloodline is connected to. It has been feeling you wake up, the same way you have been feeling it. You have been calling to each other, across a very long silence. And now someone has come from the palace, Sarah said, because the Alpha King is losing his sight. Because the rejection of a true mate from an Ashvale bloodline does not function the way ordinary rejection functions, Marin said. The bond that exists between that bloodline and the root system is also the bond that stabilizes Alpha sight at the highest level. When Kale Voss rejected you, the rejection fed back through the ley line network into his sight. He is losing the thing his authority rests on because he rejected the thing that would have maintained it. That is a significant consequence for a 3-second decision, Sarah said. Yes, Marin said. It is. Sarah thought about 12 territories and the wolves living in them, who had no part in any of this, and would feel the consequences anyway. She thought about pack bonds thinning, territorial seams fraying, border instabilities that nobody could trace to a source, because the source was below the level of ordinary understanding. There is more I need to tell you, Marin said, about the network itself, about what your presence does and what your absence has done, and what the restoration of it can and cannot accomplish. She told her about the ley line network in detail, about the 3 centuries of gradual erosion since the last Ashvale wolf had been removed from the world, about the things the territories had been experiencing that nobody had been able to explain, the declining alpha power across the board over generations that each generation's alphas had attributed to personal failing rather than structural cause, the weakening of pack bonds that had required increasingly formal and rigid pack hierarchy to compensate for what the natural bond structure was no longer providing reliably, the border territories, in a state of near constant low friction that the various territorial councils managed as a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a symptom of something larger. All of it traceable, all of it having a source, all of it connected to the absence of the thing that Sarah carried. I need to understand, Sarah said slowly, what my being in the world does, specifically, not in the language of the old records, in terms of what actually happens. Your presence stabilizes the network, Marin said, not through any act you perform, simply by existing in it. The way a deep root stabilizes the soil, not by doing anything specific, but by being there. You are the anchor, the network knows it. The pack bonds that run on top of the network are steadier when the anchor holds. And the suppression has been keeping me from providing that stabilization. For 22 years, Marin said. Yes. Sarah sat with this for a long moment. She looked at the lineage book, at her own name, at the bottom of a tree that had been reduced from many to one, by people who were afraid of something they did not understand. Tell me about the Covenant, she said. Rylan mentioned them. Marin's expression changed slightly. The Covenant is an organization that has been operational for at least 2 centuries. Their founding purpose was to ensure that the Ashvale bloodline did not return. When the Voss dynasty finished the hunting, the Covenant was established to maintain what the hunting had achieved. They have been looking for any Ashvale survivor for 100 years. The ceremony changed your visibility to them. Then I should not be in Duskfield when they arrive, Sarah said. That is my thinking, Marin said. And the palace is both the most dangerous place I can go and the most defensible. Also my thinking. Sarah looked at the old woman across the table, at the sharp eyes and the white hair, and the hands that smelled permanently of pine sap and something indefinable. She thought about 6 weeks of tea and quiet evenings, and the first space in years that had felt like something she had chosen. Come with me, she said. Marin shook her head. I go where I go, she said simply. I do not go where trouble concentrates itself. That is how I have lasted this long. She picked up the oilcloth wrapping that was already on the table, already prepared, and wrapped the lineage book and pressed it into Sarah's hands. Take this, read everything in it. She stood. She put both hands on Sarah's face, the way a person holds something they want to memorize, briefly and without sentimentality. Do not be afraid of the mark, she said. The fear of it is the only thing that makes it dangerous. Then, you already know who you are. You knew it when you laughed. Keep knowing it. 3 days later, Sarah walked out of Duskfield with Rylan beside her. Marin had left a small bundle of dried lavender, tied with twine on the back step. Sarah put it in her coat pocket. She walked away from Duskfield without looking back. She carried it with her instead, the way you carry things that matter, internally, where they do not require a glance over your shoulder to remain present. She had walked into a packed kitchen at 14, with her wolf locked behind a door she could not open, and she had spent the following 8 years learning everything that could be learned about carrying weight without letting anyone see the effort, about moving through rooms full of people who had decided not to see her, about making herself useful in the narrow way that was permitted, without making herself visible in any way that would draw the kind of attention that resulted in additional closures. She had been very good at it. That had never been the question. The question, the one she had been circling without being able to name it for 22 years, was why the locked door felt like a flaw in herself, rather than a working that someone else had placed on her. She had believed the broken shift was hers, a failure of her own nature, the wolf that did not develop correctly, the mark that did not hold its color. She had believed it because there was nothing in her environment to suggest otherwise, and believing the alternative, that she was not broken but hidden, would have required a faith in herself for which she had no evidence and no support. And now here was Marin telling her she had not been broken at all. She sat with that. Not the information about the bloodline and the ley lines and the anchor function, which was large, and would take time to fully absorb, that specific piece. Not broken. Hidden. By someone who loved her enough to make her invisible in order to keep her alive. She thought about her mother, Ilara, a name she had been given by the pack's record keeper at age 6, when the pack sickness story had been constructed around her arrival. A name she had been told was her mother's name, without being told anything else. She had held the name for 22 years, and built around it nothing, because there was nothing to build with. No stories, no objects, no secondary memories from people who had known her. Just the name, held carefully in the space where a mother would have been. Now she had more. Ilara had been the second to last, had been brave and practical, and had understood exactly what she was, and had used that understanding to ensure that the last one survived long enough for the story to not end with her. Had built a working that held for 22 years, which was not easy, which required significant power and significant precision, and had then gone into hiding and eventually out of the world entirely, and had not been able to tell her daughter any of it, because telling her would have meant naming what she was. And naming what she was would have made her visible. Sarah understood this with the bone-level certainty of someone who had spent 22 years making herself invisible on a much smaller scale, and understood what it cost, and why it was sometimes the only option. She thought about all the things Ilara had given her by giving her nothing, no family name, no origin, no visible connection to anything that would have made her a target, the ordinary invisibility of a low-ranked Omega in a border pack, the faded mark that read as failure rather than suppression, the locked wolf that read as broken rather than hidden, and the laugh. She had laughed in that hall without knowing why, without knowing what she was or what she was for, and Marin had said she already knew who she was, and she thought about that, and she thought she understood it now. It was not that she had known the information. It was that beneath the locked door and the faded mark and 22 years of being told she was insufficient, something in her had known that the insufficiency was imposed rather than inherent. Some bedrock level of herself had held, throughout everything, the knowledge that she was more than what the picture said. The laugh had come from that bedrock. She was glad she had laughed. She was glad it had been audible. The journey north took 4 days, and on the second day, Sarah felt the presences for the first time. She had been paying careful attention to the sensitivity the waking mark gave her, testing it cautiously, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. It was not sight, and not sound, and not exactly feeling, though feeling was the closest word. It was the particular awareness of discord, of things that vibrated at a frequency that did not match the surrounding ley line energy. The way you hear a wrong note in music you know well before your mind has consciously registered which note it is. 3 of them, moving parallel to the road, about a mile east. Keeping pace, she told Rylan. He processed it without questioning it, and sent messages she did not track to destinations she did not ask about, and in the morning 2 additional people had joined them without ceremony, which told her Rylan had resources she had not been shown. This was appropriate. The 3 presences did not close the distance over the next 2 days. They were tracking rather than intercepting, gathering information about where the group was going, rather than acting on instructions to stop it. Someone had told them to watch. That someone would be reassessing as the situation developed. She thought about this, and thought about the palace, and began, during the walking hours, to build in her mind the map she would need of both the space and the people in it before the Covenant was ready to move. Kale came to meet them outside the city on the morning they arrived, which she had not expected. He was on horseback with 2 guards held at a significant distance, and he dismounted when the group came into view and stood by the road, not because it was required, because he chose to. She looked at him as she came within speaking distance. He was thinner than he had been at the ceremony, 3 weeks of inadequate sleep written in his face, and the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone managing everything with reduced resources, using all that remained to keep the reduction from showing. She recognized it because she had been doing the same thing for 22 years, the specific art of functioning correctly while carrying something heavy that you were not going to let anyone else see the weight of. She came to a stop in front of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke for a moment. "You look exhausted," she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement, but was in that direction. "I have not slept well." "I know, Ryland told me." She met his eyes directly. "I am here. I want you to understand why, before we go any further. I am not here because you asked. I am not here because I have made any decision about the personal dimension of what happened between us. I am here because the ley lines under 12 territories have been deteriorating for 3 centuries, and I am the only thing that can address that, and the people living in those territories have no part in what happened between you and me, and will suffer the consequences anyway if I do not act. That is why I am here." He listened to all of it. "I understand," he said, "and I am grateful, for the reason you have stated." She held his gaze. "That is a better answer than I expected." "I have been working on it," he said. Something in her, small and cautious, and sensibly defended, noted this, and filed it with care. "Take me inside," she said. "Show me the archive, and tonight, sleep. I mean that practically, not as kindness. I need you functional." They rode in together. She looked at the city as they passed through it, and thought about what it meant to be responsible for all of this, all these buildings and all these people, and the enormous ongoing business of a life that was the center of something very large. The palace was more than she had anticipated, and exactly what she had anticipated simultaneously. She declined the West Wing room, and requested something smaller, with an east-facing window. The steward managed his surprise with professional competence. Kale said nothing, but she felt him notice. She put the oilcloth book on the desk of the east-facing room. She put the dried lavender on the windowsill. She went to the kitchen. The kitchen was managed by a head cook named Dora, whose professional reserve toward palace visitors adjusted when she understood that the visitor wanted leftover bread and cold meat. A young worker named Peter found her a plate and a cup of tea, with the helpfulness of someone in an unexpected situation, doing his honest best. She thanked him by name when she left. He watched her go for a moment. She ate at the kitchen table, and listened and filed. In 20 minutes, she learned more about the current state of the palace's internal life than formal briefings would have provided in a week. The council tensions, and Fell's position, and the Queen Regent's unusual seclusion, and the housekeeper Ruth's standards, and where they had been insufficient. All filed. All potentially useful. In the corridor between the kitchen and the interior wing, she met Lady Marsh, who was moving fast, and who stopped when she saw Sarah, and conducted a rapid assessment that was professional enough to be nearly admirable. "You are the one from Iron Moon," Marsh said. "My name is Sarah Ashvale," she said. The assessment recalibrated slightly. "Lady Marsh, Third Council." "Good to meet you, Lady Marsh." They assessed each other with mutual directness. "You are not what I expected," Marsh said. "I rarely am," Sarah said, and continued. That evening, Kale came to the archive room where she was working, and knocked on the open door rather than entering, which was not what she had expected. "What are you looking for?" he said. She showed him. The archive was thorough and well organized, for everything except the one category that mattered most. Every reference to the ley line network, the anchor function, the Ashvale bloodline, had been removed, or had never been filed in the accessible collection. "There is a lower level," she said. He told her about the sealed door, the 300 years, the missing key. She showed him her right wrist. He looked at the silver warmth pulsing there in the lamplight, and something behind his expression adjusted, the picture finding its level. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I want to read what is in this room first." He moved toward the door. "Kale," she said. He stopped. "Sleep tonight," she said. "Not a request, a practical instruction. I need you able to think clearly." He left. She read until the lamp failed. She went to bed and lay down in the east-facing room and looked at the strip of city and sky through the window and slept, which surprised her, and she did not dream. In the morning she followed the warmth in her wrist through the old corridors of the East Wing basement to the iron door with the carved mark at its center. She pressed her wrist to it, the mark released, the door opened. Inside was the room she had not known she had been waiting for, shelved with documents and covered on its fourth wall with carved script, and on the nearest shelf the record that would give her the first full picture of what she was, and what she was for. Kale sat on the floor with his back against the shelf and waited while she read. She read for a long time. When she finished, she turned and told him what she had found. She told it plainly, which was the only way she knew to make sure what she said was actually received. The ley lines were structural. The anchor function was real and specific and consequential. 3 centuries of its absence had produced 3 centuries of symptoms that had been managed as unrelated problems by every generation of people responsible for managing them. He heard it. Not performed hearing, not strategic hearing, actual absorption. She told him she needed Edmund, a scholar from the Eastern Territory University who had been working with the First Age script for 20 years. She told him which one. She told him she had used the 3 days in Duskfield to prepare. Something moved in his expression that was possibly the nearest thing to a smile that his face did when no one was performing for anyone. "I will send for him tonight," he said. They walked out of the lower archive together. The iron door closed behind them, with the sound of a long breath finally released, and the warmth stayed in the room. At the top of the stairs she paused. "The presences I felt on the road," she said. "They belong to an organization called the Covenant. They will know I am here within a day of my arriving. We should assume from the beginning that we are operating with a timeline." He looked at her. "What kind of timeline?" "Weeks," she said. "Maybe less. They have been hunting the Ashvale bloodline for 300 years. They are not going to wait long once they have confirmed the location. What do we do about that?" "We do the work," she said, "quickly and thoroughly, and we let me feel where they are, and when they are moving, and we make a plan based on what I can feel, rather than on assumptions." She paused. "They are afraid of what I am. The best way to address that fear is to let them see what I am actually is, rather than what they believe it to be." He absorbed this. "Trust me," she said. "Yes," he said simply. They went upstairs. The road north had a quality that she did not expect, which was openness. She had spent most of her life in enclosed spaces, kitchens and corridors and the small back room, and the particular compressed social geography of a pack, where everyone knew everyone's rank and conducted themselves accordingly at all times. Even Duskfield, which was the most open social environment she had inhabited, was a small town with small-town rhythms and the specific closeness of a community that relied on itself because it had no other option. The road was different. The road was the open terrain between places, the spaces that did not belong to anything, that had no rank structure or social expectation, that were simply the distance between one thing and the next. She found she liked it. She found she liked the particular quality of walking through space that was not organized around her, that asked nothing of her, that was simply there to be walked through. She had spent 22 years in organized space, space that expected her to be something specific, and was always assessing whether she was meeting the expectation. The road expected nothing. Rylan was a comfortable walking companion because he understood when to talk and when not to, which was a skill she had found was rarer than it should have been. He talked when there was something to say, and was quiet when there was not, and the quiet was comfortable rather than pointed. They covered the first day in good time, and made camp that evening in a clearing off the road, with the efficiency of 2 people who had both spent considerable portions of their lives managing with whatever was available. She thought about the Covenant that night, sitting by the small fire Rylan had built, not anxiously, practically, building the picture of what she knew about them from what Marin had told her. An organization 2 centuries old, field agents at the operational level, a coordination level above that, A leadership level above that, the most protected and least visible layer. The communication structure, carefully designed, to prevent any one level from having complete knowledge of the levels above it. She thought about what motivated people at each level. The leadership level, she suspected, was the true believers, the ones who had kept the ideology alive across 2 centuries, not because they had to, but because they had made the ideology into identity. The field agents, based on what Marin had described, were more varied, some committed, and some simply occupying the only structured life that had been available to them when they were recruited. The difference mattered. You could not reason someone out of an identity. You could not argue someone out of a sense of self that they had built their whole life on, but you could let them feel something that contradicted the identity's description of the world, and the feeling could do what argument could not. This was the idea she had been carrying since she arrived at the palace, and felt the Covenant presences in the building, and understood what they were, and what they were afraid of. She had been turning it over for weeks. She did not yet know exactly what it would look like. She thought it might look like standing in the middle of the Great Hall and stopping, holding back. In the morning they continued north. The 2 additional wolves who had joined them traveled at a comfortable distance that said they were part of the group without advertising it, which was correct. The 3 Covenant presences on the East Road had not closed the distance overnight. Still tracking, still patient. She watched the landscape change as they moved north toward the capital, the border scrubland giving way to more managed terrain, the occasional farm giving way to the outskirts of settlements, the settlements growing larger and closer together. The scale of the Alpha King's territory becoming visible in the ordinary fact of how much organized human and wolf life existed within its radius. She thought about responsibility of that scale. She had spent 22 years with no one depending on her except in the immediate practical sense of tasks completed and functions performed. She had been a function, not a presence. Now she was moving toward the center of something that 12 million people lived inside of, and she was moving toward it carrying the information that she was the only thing that could address what was wrong with the structure holding all of it up. She thought about this without either inflating it or minimizing it. Both were tempting, and both were inaccurate. The temptation to inflate was the temptation toward the grandiose, the sense of special destiny, that was sometimes the story people told about power, to make it feel meaningful rather than simply heavy. The temptation to minimize was the opposite, the story that said it was not her responsibility, that someone else should be doing this, that she could decline. She could not decline. There was no one else. She was the last. She carried that and kept walking. The Covenant moved on Duskfield 2 days after Sarah left it. Ryland told her this on the 3rd morning after her arrival at the palace, with the precision he used for all information that had operational implications. 3 agents had arrived at the herb shop. The shop was locked and empty. Marin was gone. Sarah received this information without showing the particular kind of relief she felt, because relief was not the useful object in this moment. What mattered was that Marin had been gone before the Covenant arrived, which told her what she needed to know about Marin's timeline, and her awareness of it. The old woman had given herself exactly the preparation she needed, and used every hour of it. The 3 agents who had found an empty shop would now be reporting north. They would confirm her location at the palace within a day, possibly less. This gave the situation a shape and a timeline that she could work with. She told Cale at breakfast. She had established breakfast as a working meeting in the first week, because it was the one time of day before the palace's administrative machinery reached full operation, and they could have actual conversations rather than managed ones. She had also established that the conversations at breakfast were honest ones, which was a standard she held to regardless of how the information landed. "They know I am here," she said. "If they did not know before, they will confirm it today or tomorrow. We should not operate under the assumption that my location is a secret." He set down the document he had been reading. "How long do you think we have before they act?" "That depends on their calculation," she said. "If they believe that what I represent becomes harder to address with more time, they move quickly. If they believe they can achieve their objective through indirect means, they are more patient." She paused. "I think they will move quickly. The events of the ceremony changed the landscape for them as much as for us. What was a latent threat has become an active one, from their perspective." "What is their objective, specifically?" he said. "To ensure the anchor function does not return to operation," she said. "They are not primarily concerned with me as a person. They are concerned with what my existence and my waking power means for the pack bond structure and the territorial system as it has developed over 3 centuries without a functional ley line anchor. She looked at him directly. They are not wrong that restoring the anchor function will change things. It will change things considerably. They are wrong about whether that change is harmful. But from inside their framework, the fear is coherent. He looked at her. You understand them. I try to understand the things I am dealing with, she said. It is more efficient than not understanding them. Edmund arrived from the Eastern Territory on the 5th day, which was the fastest the message and the journey could account for, and still meant that he had left within approximately 12 hours of receiving the message and had not stopped for anything, except the minimum necessary. He shook Sarah's hand, asked immediately if he could see the lower archive, and was in it within 20 minutes. He emerged at dinner with the expression of a man who had discovered that a subject he had devoted 40 years to was considerably larger than he had understood, and who found this genuinely exciting rather than destabilizing, which told her something important about the kind of person he was. They established a working rhythm, Edmund in the mornings independently, Sarah joining him after midday, the wall script yielding itself section by section as his literacy and the mark's presence combined toward the full picture. She spent her mornings on the council and the territories, and the ongoing political work of explaining what had happened, and what it meant, and what would happen next. This was not a single conversation. It was hundreds of conversations, conducted simultaneously, at different paces and levels of detail, adjusted for each territory's specific situation, and each council member's specific concerns. Fell was cautious, and becoming less so. Marsh was engaged, and increasingly useful. Douglas and Petra remained cautious for reasons she had come to understand were structural, because the territories they represented had developed the most elaborate compensation systems for the absence of the natural ley line function, and the people most embedded in those systems had the most reason to be uncertain about a change whose end they could not yet see. She did not dismiss these concerns. She addressed them with the patience they deserved. Isara had not yet made contact. She thought about Isara often. In the way you think about a door you know you are going to have to open, and are not quite ready to open. She was giving it time. The time would come. On the 8th evening after her arrival, she felt the Covenant presences shift. She was in her room at the desk when she felt it, the particular change in quality that told her the 3 signals she had been tracking had received new instructions. Not the patient tracking of the preceding week, something more purposeful, more directed. She went immediately to Cale. He was in his study. He looked up when she came in and read her face with the accuracy he had been developing. Now, he said. Not tonight, she said, but soon. They are no longer watching. They are preparing. She paused. I want to talk through the plan. They talked through the plan. It was not complicated. She had never believed in complexity for its own sake, when simplicity was available. Let the Covenant agents move into position. Let them enter the palace. Make sure when they acted in a place and in front of witnesses who could not be managed afterward. The Great Hall was the right place. The council assembled was the right audience. The full release of the mark in that room, in front of those witnesses, was the right action. He listened. He agreed without modifying or negotiating, which she had come to appreciate as a consistent quality of his approach when she had thought something through, and was presenting it as a conclusion rather than a proposal. There is something else, she said. He waited. The people they send, she said. They will not all be there because they believe the ideology. Some will be there because the organization provides them with something they need. Structure, purpose, a place to belong. Those people can be addressed differently than the ones who have made the fear into a principle. She paused. I want to address them differently. He looked at her. One of the people they send, she said, could become useful to us in a way that is worth more than any information we could extract through pressure. If I am right about what they will see and feel when the mark releases, the ones who are there for reasons other than the ideology are going to have a more significant response to it than the ones who are there because they believe. And you will be watching for that, he said. Yes, she said. On the 9th evening, Cale came to her room with his tea, and sat in the chair across from her desk, and they talked about other things, about the council and the territories, and what Edmund had found in the latest section of the wall script, and she let the conversation be what it was, which was the conversation of two people who were building something shared, and finding that the building was easier than either of them had expected it to be. She also told him, that evening, about what had happened to her at 14. Not in detail, but enough. The locked wolf that she had spent 8 years believing was her own failure. The faded mark she had spent 22 years reading as a verdict rather than a disguise. What it had been like to carry something broken that was not actually broken. To carry someone else's protective working as if it were her own limitation. He listened to all of it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I looked at you in that hall, and I saw the rank mark, and I saw the broken shift, and I made a calculation in 3 seconds." He paused. What I did not see, what I was not willing to see, was that the visible picture was not the complete picture. "No," she said, "it was not." "I am sorry," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I could see that you were, within the hour." She paused. "That does not make it not wrong, but it does mean that the wrong is something you understood. And understanding a wrong is the beginning of doing something different." He was quiet. "Get some sleep," she said. "The day after tomorrow is going to require everything." He left. She sat for a while in the quiet room, with the east window dark and the city lights below, and the dried lavender on the windowsill. And she thought about the plan, and whether it was good, and concluded that it was. Then she went to bed. In the morning the Covenant moved. The palace received her arrival in the way palaces received arrivals that did not fit the established categories. Not badly, not with overt hostility. With the particular organizational uncertainty of a large institution encountering something it does not have a form for. She found this interesting rather than uncomfortable. She had spent her life in institutions that had forms for everything, and slotted her into the lowest available form. The fact that this institution did not have a form for her meant she had some latitude in what form she occupied, which was, from a purely practical standpoint, an advantage she intended to use. She used the first week to learn the building. Not its formal geography, which anyone could read from a floor plan. Its actual geography, the way it functioned in practice, which corridors were actually used for which purposes, which rooms were theoretically meeting rooms but were actually storage, which exits were maintained, and which were technically available but in practice never opened, which parts of the building had high traffic at which hours, and which were essentially empty from mid-morning to early afternoon. She walked it, quietly and without announcing that she was walking it, in the spaces between the scheduled activities she was attending, or the archive work, or the kitchen conversations. She walked it the way she had walked the Iron Moon Pack Hall for 8 years, learning its floor by memory. She was good at this. It was one of the skills that the 8 years had given her, and that she had no intention of setting down, just because the context had changed. She also learned the people, not in the formal way of memorizing names and roles, though she did that too. In the more important way of understanding who trusted whom and why, who occupied which role formally, versus who actually held the function the role described, where the real decisions were made, as opposed to where the announced decisions were made. This was the inside of the institution, the part that did not appear on any official list. The kitchen gave her most of it, the kitchen and the early morning corridors before the formal day began, and the late evening corridors after the formal day ended, the times when people moved through the building as themselves, rather than as their roles. She paid attention during those hours with the specific, focused attention she brought to everything she considered worth understanding. She understood the palace by the end of the first week well enough to navigate it. By the end of the second week she understood it well enough to work within it. By the end of the third she understood it well enough to begin changing it. Not dramatically, not through formal announcements or structural reorganizations, through the small consistent actions of a person who knew what she was doing and did it directly and without performance. Through the conversations she had in corridors, through the questions she asked in the kitchen that prompted people to think about things they had not been asked to think about before, through the attention she paid, consistently and without exception, to every person she interacted with as someone whose name mattered and whose work mattered, and whose perspective on what was happening in the building was worth knowing. Small things. The building was made of small things. She knew this. She had mopped enough floors to know this. She felt them enter the city in the pre-dawn gray, 5 of them in one approach, and a 6th, arriving separately, 20 minutes behind, and the 6th carried a quality she had not felt in the previous agents, the particular resonance of someone with decision-making authority, rather than someone acting on instruction from it. She dressed. She knocked on the wall between her room and Ryland's. 3 knocks, then 2. She heard movement almost immediately, which told her he had been sleeping lightly in preparation for exactly this. She tracked the 6 presences through the city as she got ready, feeling them move through the streets with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who had a clear plan and sufficient confidence in it. They were heading for the palace, not rushing. The approach of people who had made a decision and were executing it. Ryland knocked on her door 8 minutes later, already dressed, already processing. 6, she told him. The Eastern approach. One of them is leadership. Timeline? An hour to the inner palace, she said. Perhaps less, if they accelerate once through the gates. I will have the guard positioned in 10 minutes. Not in their path, she said. Let them come through. I need them to reach the hall. He looked at her for a fraction of a second, with the expression of someone whose instinct was pointing in a different direction, but who had developed enough trust in her judgment to override it. How far in? Far enough that the council can see exactly who they are, and exactly what they came for, she said. I need witnesses who cannot be managed or denied afterward. The emergency council session is already called, he said. Fell was notified 90 minutes ago. Marsh also. Good. She looked at the window, at the 6 presences moving through the dark streets below. Go. I will be at the hall in 40 minutes. He went. She sat in the chair by the east window for 10 minutes and let herself be still. This was a technique she had developed over years of difficult mornings, the quieting of the mind's running current so that when the moment required everything, everything was there. She thought about Marin, about the pine sap and the 2 cups of tea, and the evenings that had been the first evenings in years, that felt chosen rather than endured. She thought about what Marin had said. Do not be afraid of it. The fear is the only thing that makes it dangerous. She was not afraid. She was something else, something she did not have a precise word for. The sensation of standing at the top of a very high place, before a jump that is both necessary and irreversible. Not fear. The cousin of fear, the one that was about scale rather than danger. She stood up. She looked at the dried lavender on the windowsill for a moment. Then she walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the great hall. The hall was beginning to fill when she arrived. Council members filing in with the alertness of people who had been summoned urgently and were running their own calculations about what urgently meant. Cale was at the far end, standing. Ryland was at the side door in the way of a person positioned at a door who was choosing not to appear to be positioned at a door. She walked to the center of the flagstone floor and stood there. She tracked the 6 presences moving through the palace, through the lower corridor, up the interior stairs, through the inner passage, coming. The side door at the east end of the hall opened. 5 of the 6 came in fast, and they spread as they entered, taking in the room in the professional way of people who had done this kind of thing many times. They saw the council members. They saw Cale at the far end. They saw Ryland at the door. They saw Sarah standing alone in the center of the hall. They stopped. The lead agent was a tall man, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had been doing this work for a long time, and had made the work into himself. He looked at Sarah, and his assessment was rapid and professional. Then he said, in a voice that was controlled and certain, "Come with us. This does not need to become complicated." "It is already complicated," Sarah said. "I think what you mean is that it does not need to become visible. But visible is exactly what it needs to be." He moved toward her. She stopped holding back. The mark released all at once, and it went down. Not outward, not upward. Down. Into the floor, into the stone foundation, into the earth below the foundation, down into the layer of ley lines that ran under the palace hill, and under the city, and out in every direction, toward the 12 territories, like the root system of something enormous, that had been waiting 3 centuries for this particular connection to close. The silver light that appeared in the hall was a side effect, a visible surface of something that was primarily happening below the level of visibility. It spread across the flagstone floor, and up the stone walls, and through the window glass, and out into the pre-dawn air of the city. But the thing itself, the anchor function, the signal the ley line network had been absent of for 300 years, that went through the earth, and through the network, and touched every pack bond, and every territorial seam, and every alpha connection simultaneously. In the hall, the effect was quiet, not dramatic. The sensation of something settling, the rightness of something finding the place it belonged after a very long time displaced, like a held breath released. Like a sound that had been slightly wrong for so long that you had forgotten it was wrong, suddenly corrected, and the correction was so complete that for a moment you could hear both versions simultaneously and understand the difference between them. This was felt across 12 territories at the same moment. In 100,000 wolves who had no context for what they were feeling and no language for it, it arrived as a settling in the chest, as a drawing of breath, as the sense that something had been not quite right for a very long time, and was, briefly and clearly, and without any ambiguity at all, right. The 5 Covenant agents had stopped moving. The lead agent with the gray hair was not looking at Sarah. He was looking at his hands, not calculating, not assessing. Looking at his hands with the expression of someone who has felt something they were told they would not feel, something they were told was dangerous and destabilizing, and has discovered in the feeling of it that what they had been told was wrong. That was the shift she had been watching for. She saw it, in him and in 2 of the others, to varying degrees. The remaining 2 had less visible reactions, which told her they were further into the belief structure rather than the need structure. She filed it. Rylan moved. The palace guard that had been held out of sight came in from the corridor. It was efficient and without drama. The 5 agents were secured before any of them recovered from what they had felt enough to consider resistance. The 6th presence, the one with leadership quality, was gone from the corridor, had run when the mark released. She noted this and set it aside for later. Kale came across the full length of the hall to her. He came without hurry, the way someone comes toward a thing they have decided to go toward. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the full, clear attention he had had in the forest the morning she agreed to come. Not the controlled attention of a man managing a situation. Just attention, clean and complete. "The North," he said. His voice was quiet in the large room. His eyes were different from what they had been all month. Clearer. The particular depth of restored capacity, of a sense that had been failing, suddenly present again at full strength. "I can feel it again. All of it. The sight is back." "Good," she said. "It will not hold permanently from one release. The anchor function needs sustained stabilization over time. But the network has the signal now. It knows what is here." He looked at her. "You are here," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I am." Around them, the council members were recovering from the particular stillness that had taken the hall when the mark released. Lady Marsh was looking at the windows. Lord Fell was looking at Sarah across the floor, and when she met his gaze, after a moment, he looked down. "I need to sit down," she said to Kale, "and I need tea." He found her a chair. Peter appeared with tea within 5 minutes. She drank it. The exhaustion of the release sat on her like something earned rather than imposed, the tiredness of completion, of a thing that had been building for a long time and had finally gone where it needed to go. She set down the cup. The work began. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Hall, in the hour after the agents were secured and the council members had recovered from the particular stillness that the mark's release had produced in them, and had begun the process of talking with each other in the low, urgent tones of people who have just shared a significant experience, Sarah sat in the chair Kale had found for her, and drank her tea, and thought about the lead agent. The tall man with the gray hair, Graham. She had since learned his name was Graham. She had watched his face in the moment the mark released. She had been watching all 5 of their faces, but his was the one she returned to in the hour after, the particular quality of what she had seen there. Not calculation, not the professional assessment of a trained agent encountering an unexpected development, something more fundamental than that. The expression of a person who had felt something they had been told they would not feel, and who had found, in the feeling of it, that the thing they had been told was wrong. She had seen that expression before. Not in so extreme a form, but she recognized the family of it. It was the expression of dissonance, the internal experience of reality, contradicting a deeply held belief. The particular quality of it in someone who had never had that specific dissonance before, for whom the belief in question had always been confirmed rather than challenged. It changed things. Not immediately, not through a single moment of revelation that produced a complete reversal. But the dissonance, once experienced, did not simply reverse itself. It could be suppressed, defended against, explained away. People did that, but it could not be unfelt. The felt contradiction between what you had believed and what you had experienced was a thing that continued to work on a person, sometimes slowly and sometimes not, but always. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about the covenant structure and what it meant that the field agents were the most accessible level of it. The people who had been sent to the palace were field agents. They had beliefs, some of them, and needs, others of them, and the specific complex of reasons that kept any individual in an organization they had committed years of their life to. But they were also the people closest to the thing the organization existed to prevent. They were the ones who had been in the hall when the mark released. They were the ones who had felt it. That mattered in a way she was still working out the full implications of. She finished her tea and looked at the hall around her, at the council members still in their chairs talking, at Ryland directing the movement of the secured agents toward the holding area with the same efficiency he brought to everything, at the flagstone floor where the silver light had spread and then faded, and where the warmth of what had happened still seemed to her to exist, though that might have been her perception rather than the room. She thought about Claire. She did not know yet which of the agents was Claire. She would find out, but she had felt, in the second and third of the 5 faces she had watched in the moment of release, something she recognized, a variation of what she had seen in Graham's face, less pronounced but present. 2 of them, possibly 3. 3 out of 5 was not a small number. 3 out of 5 who had experienced the dissonance at a level that might be worked with. She thought about what working with that could look like. Not immediately. Give it time. Let the dissonance settle. Let them have the experience of sitting with what they had felt. Then visit. Talk. Not with the agenda of extracting information, though information would eventually become relevant. With the agenda of understanding who they were, and what had brought them there, and what they were feeling now about what they had felt. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was one of the things the 8 years had given her. She set down the cup. She stood up. "Rylan," she said. He came to her. "The ones who are in the holding area," she said. "I want to know which of them were in positions requiring belief as their primary motivation, and which were in positions requiring the organization to provide something else. Structure, income, belonging. As much detail as is available." He nodded. "I will find out." "Thank you," she said. She walked toward the door. Behind her, the great hall continued its work of being the hall where something significant had happened, holding the echo of it in the way that rooms hold the echoes of significant things, in the quality of the air and the particular way the light fell through the windows and the specific grain of the stone floor that had held the weight of the moment. She walked to the kitchen and asked Peter for a second cup of tea. He made it without comment, which was its own kind of grace. The palace in the weeks that followed the Great Hall was a different place from the palace before it. Not visibly. Not in any way a person encountering it for the first time would have identified. The corridors were the same. The meeting rooms held the same furniture. The kitchen ran on the same schedule and produced the same food, and Peter still appeared with tea, in a way that had evolved from uncertain helpfulness into reliable instinct. But the quality of attention in the building had shifted. Sarah noticed it the way she noticed most things, in the small, consistent details, rather than the large, stated ones. The cleaning staff moved through the halls with less tension in their shoulders, the particular reduction in bracing that comes when a space stops being one where you expect to be found at fault. The conversations she overheard in the kitchen were more open, less managed. Ruth had reorganized 2 storage areas in the east wing that had apparently been in disorder for some time, a project deferred because the administrative backing for it had not previously existed, and the completion of it had produced a small but genuine satisfaction in her that expressed itself as a general improvement in her posture. Small things. But small things were what buildings were made of. Sarah had mopped enough floors to understand that. The council sessions were more complex. She had been attending them for 2 weeks, in a chair at the side of the room, in a position that was appropriate to her current standing, and that she did not want to overreach. But she listened, and she had developed an accurate map of how the information moved through that group of people, and where the genuine reconsiderations were occurring, and where the managed positions were. Fell was genuinely reconsidering. She had concluded this by the end of the first week, through the accumulated evidence of his questions becoming more substantive, more oriented toward understanding, rather than toward building a case. He had not said anything directly to her. He did not need to. Marsh had always been in information-seeking mode, rather than resistance mode. She was building toward a position. Given what Sarah had observed of her, the position would be well-reasoned, and would be stated clearly when she had reached it. Douglas and Petra remained cautious, which Sarah had come to understand was structural rather than personal. Their territories had developed the most elaborate compensation systems for the absent ley line function, the most rigid hierarchical structures for managing the declining natural pack bond. Restoring the natural function was going to require those structures to change, and the people embedded in those structures had the most reason to be uncertain about a change they could not fully see the end of. She understood this. She made a note to speak with both of them separately, at the right moment, about what the transition would look like, and what the pace of change was, and what support would be available through it. Edmund was in the lower archive every day. She worked with him in the afternoons, and what they were building together was becoming the most complete picture of the ley line network and its history that had existed since the records were sealed in the dark, 300 years ago. Edmund translated. Sarah contributed where the mark was required. The catalog they were assembling was thorough and accurate, and organized by Edmund, with the particular devotion of a scholar, who understood that he was working with material that would be the authoritative reference on its subject for generations. She told him this one afternoon. He looked up from his notes. "I know," he said. "That is why I am not rushing it." On the 14th day after the Great Hall, Isara sent a message. 2 lines. Precise handwriting. The message said, "I would like to speak with you, when you are ready." Sarah read it twice, and put it in her pocket. She had been thinking about Isara regularly, in the way you think about a closed door, that you know you are going to open eventually, and are not quite ready to open yet. Isara was the most complicated presence in the palace, the person with the clearest knowledge of what had happened, and the most direct role in it, who had been sitting in the East Wing for weeks, with 30 years of political knowledge, and the particular stillness of someone who understood exactly what they had done, and was waiting to find out what would be done with that understanding. She thought about what she wanted from the conversation. She turned it over carefully until she had the accurate answer rather than the comfortable one. She did not want an apology in the simple sense. What she wanted was honesty, and the 30 years of political knowledge in Isara's head, and the end of the particular pressure that came from leaving a door closed that both parties knew was going to be opened. She went to the East Wing on the morning of the 15th day. Isara was standing at the window. She turned when Sarah entered, and looked at her with the complete stillness of a woman who had prepared for this conversation thoroughly, and was not going to let the preparation show. She said what she had to say. She had made choices from fear. She had known they might be wrong. She had made them anyway. She was not offering that as an excuse, because it was not an excuse. It was an explanation, and the distinction mattered. Sarah listened to all of it. "I understand the fear," she said when Isara finished. "A power you cannot see fully, operating alongside an authority you have spent 30 years protecting. The fear itself is not the thing I am interested in." She paused. "What I am interested in is what you do with what you understand now." Isara was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" she said. Sarah told her. The 30 years of political knowledge, the inside of the machinery, who trusted whom and why, which alliances were genuine and which were managed, where the real resistance would come from and why, how to approach the 12 territorial leaders in ways that would actually be heard. Isara sat down. Sarah sat down. They talked for 2 hours. It was the most useful political education Sarah had received since arriving in the palace. Afterward, she walked back through the corridor toward her room and thought about the difference between people who held knowledge as power and people who gave it as contribution, and about how that distinction was not fixed, how it could shift when the circumstances changed enough and the person doing the holding understood clearly enough what the stakes were. She did not forgive Isara in the simple completed sense. She did not think that was the right frame. What she did was understand her more fully, and proceed from that understanding, which was how she moved through most things. Isara stepped down from the council on the 18th day. She announced it herself, in a brief written statement to the council chair, without being asked by anyone. She was not leaving the palace. She was removing herself from the formal seat she had occupied for too long, and which needed space for different people now. Fell and Marsh both signed the formal record of her departure. Marsh did it with the expression of someone who had been waiting for that document for some time. The 5 Covenant agents who had been secured in the Great Hall were held in the palace's lower wing. Sarah had visited the cell rooms twice a week, not because she was required to, because of the shift she had seen in the tall man's face, in 2 of the others, when the mark released in the hall. She had been right about the distinction. The tall man, whose name was Graham, and a woman named Claire, had been with the Covenant for reasons that were primarily about belonging rather than belief. Graham had been recruited at a vulnerable point in his 20s, and had been given structure and purpose in exchange for loyalty to an ideology he had not fully examined. Claire was younger, earlier in the same pattern. When the mark released in the hall, they had felt something they had been told they would not feel, or had been told would feel destructive, and found that it felt like neither. It felt like something settling, something becoming right. The dissonance between what they had been told and what they had felt was producing, in both of them, the particular kind of examination that dissonance sometimes produces in people who are honest with themselves. Sarah had 4 conversations with Claire over the following 2 weeks. On the 4th, Claire said she wanted to be useful. "Tell me what that means to you," Sarah said. "I know the communication structure," Claire said. "The operational layer. I know the contact points, and the timing, and the way information moves between field agents, and the coordination level. I do not know the leadership layer, nobody below it does, but I know enough to help you trace it." She paused. "I am not asking to be free. I am asking to be useful, in a way that serves something other than what I have been serving." Sarah took this to Cale, and then to Rylan, and then to the council. Fell had concerns, which she addressed specifically and directly. Marsh supported it, which was telling. The council approved a conditional arrangement. Claire provided information under monitored conditions, monthly review. Rylan began working with Claire's information the same week. On the evening of the 22nd day, Cale came to Sarah's room with his tea, and sat in the chair, and they had the kind of conversation they were developing between them, the kind that was honest about things, and did not perform around them. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up from the document she was working on. "I have been thinking about the 3 seconds, he said, "about the calculation I made. I have been over it many times, and I keep arriving at the same point, which is that the calculation was wrong, not because I had insufficient information, but because I had decided in advance what the answer was, and I used the 3 seconds to find the calculation that produced that answer, rather than the calculation that was actually right." He paused. "I understood that within an hour, I have been understanding it differently every week since." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it directly," he said. "Not as something that changes anything, just because it is true, and I have not said it directly before." "Thank you," she said, simply and meaning it. They were quiet for a moment. "The Covenant's upper layer," she said, returning to the document. "Rylan has a lead from Claire. He is following it carefully." "How long?" Cale said. "Weeks," she said, "perhaps a month. I told him to take the time to do it correctly. A premature action closes the lead and gives the leadership warning that they have been identified." "Agreed," he said. She wrote. He read through the documents Edmund had set aside for him. The evening settled around them, and the city went on outside the east window, and the ley lines ran in the earth below the city, steady and warming, doing the work they had been doing since the first anchor function was placed, and were now doing better than they had done it in 3 centuries. Edmund found the section that referenced the Covenant's founding in the 3rd week, buried in a set of administrative records from the transition period, immediately after the hunting was completed. He brought it to her in the evening, which was unusual, because Edmund's habit was to hold his findings until the morning session when they could be discussed with full attention, rather than at the end of a long day. The fact that he came to her room at 7 in the evening with the translation he had just completed said something about how significant he considered it. She read it. The record described, in the dry administrative language of someone documenting a decision made by other people, the establishment of what it called a continuity organization, tasked with the ongoing monitoring of any potential return of the bloodline that had been removed from the world. The name Covenant was not used, but the description was the organization Marin had described and the one she had been tracking in the palace. What she had not known was who had established it. Not the Voss dynasty directly. Not the Alpha King of that period, who had ordered the hunting. His successor, the second generation, who had inherited the outcome and had apparently been uncertain enough about its permanence to create a structure specifically designed to manage any deviation from it. The second generation, she thought. The ones who had inherited the fear without being the ones who had made the original decision from it. The ones who had grown up in a world that had been changed by the decision, and who had built on top of that changed world without questioning the change itself. She thought about what that meant for the Covenant's current membership, 2 centuries later. The people in it now were so many generations removed from the original fear that the fear itself was something they had learned rather than felt. They were maintaining something without knowing what it had originally been in response to. The organization had become the purpose rather than the original fear being the purpose. This was the thing that could be redirected. An organization that existed because it existed, that had become its own reason for continuing, was not fundamentally different from any other organization in that regard. What made organizations continue was the people in them finding value in being part of them, and that value was not inherently tied to the founding purpose if the founding purpose had become distant enough that it no longer felt personal. The people in the Covenant who were there for belonging or structure, or the particular meaning that came from being part of something with a long history, were not, at the deepest level, there because they believed an Ashvale bloodline should not exist in the world. They were there because the Covenant provided them with something they needed, and they had adopted the Covenant's purpose as their own, in the way you adopt the purposes of any group you belong to long enough. That adoption was reversible if the group's purpose changed. She was thinking about this carefully when Cale came for the usual evening conversation, and she told him about Edmund's finding and what she was working through. He listened. He asked several questions that clarified her thinking by requiring her to articulate things she had been holding as intuitions. What would redirect them, he said. Something that uses the same skills and the same organizational capacity, she said. The Covenant has spent 2 centuries monitoring the wolf world for signs of the Bloodline's return. They have a network. They have analysts. They have the ability to track subtle signals across the territories. Those capacities do not become useless when their original purpose is gone. She paused. The leyline network needs monitoring. The stabilization work is not a single event. It is ongoing. The territorial bond health, the seam stability, the alpha site metrics, all of it needs consistent attention from people who understand what they are looking for and how to track it. Cale looked at her. You want to redirect the Covenant toward monitoring the leyline restoration. I want to explore whether that is possible, she said carefully. Starting with the people I can reach, the ones in the holding area whose dissonance I saw in the hall. Working up through the structure from there, if those conversations produce anything workable. She paused. The leadership level will be harder, but the leadership level may not be the place to start. He thought about it. Claire, he said. Claire is already partway there, she said. The question is whether Graham is, and who else in the holding area might be, and whether what they are willing to provide includes information about the coordination level above field operations. He was quiet for a moment. This is a very patient approach. Yes, she said. It is the right approach for this kind of thing. An organization 2 centuries old does not change quickly. You work with the individuals who are open to changing, and you build from there, and you accept that the timeline is months rather than days. He nodded. All right, he said. What do you need from me? She told him. He agreed. They worked through the details for another hour, while the city settled into the later evening, outside the east window, and the ley lines ran their steady work in the earth below. The letter was written in the first person. That was the first thing Sarah understood as Edmund read, that the final section of the carved wall was not a record, or an account, or a description of function. It was addressed to someone. It was personal, in a way that none of the rest of the archive, for all its richness, had been. Edmund read slowly and carefully, his voice in the cold archive room steady and precise, moving through the old script with the confidence of someone who had been working in this language for 40 years, and had, over the previous weeks in this archive, added substantially to that knowledge. He paused at the difficult passages, and Sarah helped, the mark on her wrist translating the deepest parts of the old script into the wordless understanding that arrived in her body before it reached her mind, and she put it into words, and Edmund incorporated the words into the reading. The letter had been written by a woman named Adara, who had been the Ashvale keeper 3 generations before the hunting began. She had written it in this room, in the archive she had built, or had built herself, for the purpose of preserving what she knew was in danger of being lost, and she had addressed it to no one specifically, and to everyone who eventually came to need it. She had known what was coming. She had not known exactly when, or exactly how, but she had understood that the fear she saw growing in the Voss dynasty's relationship to her bloodline was moving in a direction that would eventually become action. She had watched that fear for 30 years by the time she wrote the letter. She understood it well enough to know that it was not going to resolve peacefully. Fear of this kind, in people with this kind of power, tended to resolve through elimination of the thing that caused the fear, rather than through understanding of it. She had written the letter not to the people who would hunt her, to whoever came after. The explanation was not an argument. It did not try to convince anyone of anything. It was a description, careful and complete, of what the Ashvale bloodline was, and what it did, and how it had come to be. The kind of document a person writes when they have accepted that they cannot stop what is coming, but can at least ensure that the record of what was lost does not vanish along with the thing itself. She wrote about the ley line network with a precision that matched and extended what Sarah had learned from the record books, the anchor function in greater detail than any other source had provided. The way it worked not as a single action, but as a continuous state, the way being present in the world and allowing the mark to operate was sufficient. The way the network drew on that presence, the way the atmosphere draws on the warmth of the earth, not through deliberate exchange, but through the fact of proximity, and the relationship between things that were made to work together. She wrote about what the removal of the anchor would mean. She was specific. She described the declining site as a first-generation consequence, the weakening pack bonds as a second-generation consequence, the territorial instability and the declining litter rates, and the increasingly rigid hierarchical structures as later consequences, further down the chain of effect. She had projected the downstream effects of the loss with the precision of someone who had spent her life understanding the system, and what she had projected matched, with remarkable accuracy, what had actually happened over the 3 centuries since. She had known what would happen. She had written it down. She had sealed it in a room that could only be opened by the bloodline she was describing, and she had waited. Edmund read on. Adara wrote about the covenant, whose founding she had anticipated. She described, without bitterness and without drama, the pattern of fear that would produce an organization dedicated to preventing the bloodline's return, and she described what she thought that organization's limitations would be. An organization built entirely on fear of a thing, she had written, would not survive the thing becoming visible and known. What fear required was the unknown, the darkness of what might be. An organization that had spent its life describing something it had never encountered would not be able to continue once the description was tested against the reality. This was, Sarah thought, precisely what had happened in the Great Hall. Edmund read the final passage. Adara had written, in the old script that required both his literacy and the mark's presence to unlock, what has been lost does not disappear, it waits, and when it returns changed by the waiting, not diminished by absence, made different by it, stronger perhaps, wiser perhaps, but most of all, more fully itself than it was before, because it has had to become itself in the absence of anything that would have done the work for it. Edmund's voice stopped. The room was very quiet. That is the end, he said. Sarah stood with her hand still on the warm stone of the wall. The script had been fully lit while he read, every line visible in silver light. Now it dimmed slowly, word by word, returning to the dark carved stone. She removed her hand. She thought about Adara sitting in this room 3 centuries ago, writing a letter to someone she would never meet, knowing what was coming, and choosing to do the work anyway, for whoever came next. She thought about her mother, Alara, who had done the same thing in a different way, the careful working of a suppression that had held for 22 years, the decision to give her daughter an invisible life in order to give her a life at all, for a future Alara would not survive to see. She thought about Marin, who had hired a stranger in under a minute and given her 6 weeks of being a person, before giving her the information that would change what that personhood was required to carry. All of them, doing the work for whoever came next. She felt the weight of it, not as burden, because she had decided it was not a burden, as responsibility, which was different. Because responsibility was something you chose to carry, rather than something imposed. She had chosen. She was still choosing. Every morning that was what she did. Chose again. Edmund, she said. Yes. How much of the archive remains? The last 20%, he said. The deep first-age documents in the lower cases. We have not yet opened all of them. Then we open them, she said. Tomorrow. All of them, together. She went upstairs. She walked to her room and sat at the desk and picked up the pen and wrote for 3 hours without stopping, integrating what she had just heard from Adara's letter with what she had learned over the preceding weeks, writing it in plain language for the people who came after, the next keeper, and the generation after that. She was writing the continuation of what Adara had started, the record that would be here when someone else needed it. At some point, Cale knocked and came in and sat in the chair across from her desk. She waved him in without stopping writing. He poured himself tea from the pot Peter had brought up earlier and sat quietly while she finished the section she was working through. When she set down the pen, she said, "We found the last section of the wall script today. Ryland told me," he said. He said Edmund came upstairs at dinner with the expression he wears when he has discovered something significant, which apparently is different from his regular expression. Edmund discovers something significant approximately twice a week, she said. He handles it well. Cale looked at her. What was in it? She told him. She told him about Adara and the letter and what it contained, and she told him what it meant to her personally, which he did not always do, but which felt like the right thing to do with this. She told him about the weight of the 3 centuries visible in Adara's precise projections. She told him what it felt like to read the record of someone who had known exactly what would happen and had done the work anyway. He listened completely. She knew, he said. She knew everything, Sarah said. She wrote down exactly what would happen, sealed it in a room only her bloodline could open, and waited 300 years for someone to read it. He was quiet for a long moment. I want to read it, he said. Edmund will have a translation document ready in 2 days, she said. He nodded. He looked at the pages she had been working on. What are you writing? What Adara started, she said. She wrote for me. I am writing for whoever comes next. Outside the east window, the city was fully dark and lit from within. 10,000 windows throwing light into the night. All the accumulated ordinary activity of people living their lives in a city built on ley lines that were now, steadily, more themselves than they had been in 300 years. She picked up the pen again. There is something I want to ask, she said, while writing. Ask, he said. The escaped agent from the hall, she said. The one with the leadership function. Ryland's lead from Claire. Does it connect? He was quiet for a moment. It connects, he said, indirectly. A merchant in the Eastern Territory named Laura. Ryland has one source. He is working on the second. Then we wait for the second, she said. A premature action closes the lead permanently. Agreed, he said. She wrote. He sat across from her and read, and the evening continued around them, and the ley lines ran in the earth below the city, and the document under her pen grew. The thing about the letter that stayed with her longest, in the days after Edmund read it aloud in the archive room, was the last line of the middle section. Adara had been writing about the question of how to ensure the knowledge survived even if the person carrying it did not, which was the practical problem she had been thinking through for the years before she wrote the letter. The obvious answer was to write it down, which was what she was doing, but she had understood that written records could be destroyed, could be lost, could be deliberately removed from the world by the same people who were destroying everything else. The archive room itself was the solution she had arrived at. A space that could only be opened by the bloodline it was about, that would remain sealed and invisible and protected not by physical security, but by the specificity of the key. Nothing the Voss dynasty could replicate or bypass. Nothing they could see clearly enough to know they needed to destroy. But she had written, in the middle section, about something more fundamental than the physical question, about the question of what to do if the room was never found, if there was no survivor who could open it, if the bloodline simply ended and the letter sat sealed in the dark indefinitely. What did it mean to do the work of preservation when you did not know whether the preservation would ever matter? Her answer, stated directly in the plain first-person voice of the letter, was, you do it anyway. Not because you know it will be needed. Because you are the one who can do it. and you do the things that are possible for you to do, and the future takes it from there. The future is not yours to control. The work is. Sarah had read this section several times in the days after Edmund read it in the archive room. She had been thinking about it in the evenings, in the particular long thinking that happened between the formal activity of the day and sleep, when the mind did its own work on things that had been received during daylight. She thought about what Adara had known, and what she had chosen to do with that knowing. The complete picture of the loss that was coming, the complete understanding of what would be absent from the world once it was complete, and then the choice to spend the remaining time, not in mourning that absence, not in attempts to prevent what could not be prevented, but in building something that would be available when the time came that someone could use it. That was a specific kind of courage. She thought about her own version of it. She was not facing the end of something. She was, or she was trying to be, the beginning of something, the restoration of what had been absent. But the quality Adara had described, the willingness to do the work regardless of whether you would see the outcome, regardless of whether the outcome you were working toward would come to pass in the way you imagined it, regardless of whether anyone would understand or value what you had built until long after you were not there to explain it. That quality was not only for endings. It was for beginnings too. She thought about the document she was writing, the practical account of the anchor function. She had been working on it for weeks. It was not for now. The people who needed it now were getting it directly, through her presence in the palace, and her work with the council, and the territories, and the conversations she was having every day. The document was for later, for whoever came next, whenever next was, whatever form it took. She was writing for someone she would never meet, the way Adara had written for her. She thought about that, and found it not heavy but clean. The particular cleanness of a responsibility that was clear and specific and within your capacity, that did not ask you to be more than you were, or to do more than could actually be done, that simply asked you to do the thing that was yours to do, and trust the future with the rest. She picked up the pen. She wrote. The formal council seat was offered to Sarah 6 weeks after the Great Hall, and she accepted it. Cale proposed it in a session she was not attending, which was his choice, and which she found appropriate. The proposal needed to be made by the people who would vote on it, without her presence creating a social pressure that would make the vote performative, rather than genuine. She had told him this, and he had agreed without negotiating it, which was one of the things she had come to consistently trust about him. The vote was 8-2. Douglas and Petra had been the two dissents, which she had expected, and which she did not take personally because she understood the reasons. 2 thoughtful dissents were more useful in many ways than a unanimous vote that concealed unvoiced concerns. The ceremony was brief, which was her one specific request, and was honored without discussion. A document, signatures from Cale and the full council, a record in the official archive. Her title, Sarah Ashvale, ley line keeper, council seat, all territories. Not a pack rank, not a royal appointment. A designation of function, belonging to no single territory, and therefore available to all of them. She had worked on the title with the palace administrative officer over 2 evenings, rejecting several versions before arriving at the one that was accurate. Accuracy was what she needed. Anything ornamental or political in the title would have undermined the function rather than supporting it. Fell signed without hesitation. That was its own small conclusion to a long arc. Marsh signed and said she was glad they had met in the corridor on Sarah's first afternoon, which coming from Marsh was a considerable statement. Sarah told her she was also glad, which was true, because Marsh's questions over the preceding weeks had been among the most clarifying pressures she had experienced, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, and had the precision to ask toward understanding rather than toward confirmation. Edmund signed as witness, shook her hand firmly, and went back downstairs, because he was in the middle of the deep first-age documents, and the best thinking happened before 3 in the afternoon, and it was currently 2:45. She watched him go with something she recognized as affection. The morning after the signing she went to the kitchen first, as she did most mornings, and Peter made her tea without being asked, and she drank it at the kitchen table and listened to the building around her. Dora was managing the morning meal preparation with the focused satisfaction of someone who took pleasure in the work, rather than in external recognition of it. The supply delivery was arriving at the back entrance, and she could hear the reliable supplier's voice describing the morning's quality to the person checking it in. The building was going about its business, its large, ordinary, complicated business, and the quality of that business had been subtly and consistently better for 6 weeks. She thought about Marin. 3 brief messages over 6 weeks, no return address on any of them. The first saying she was well. The second noting the lavender quality in the East Market district. The third, which had arrived 4 days ago, consisting only of, "The work you are doing is the right work." She had put all 3 in the desk drawer with the oilcloth lineage book. She thought about the herb shop and the back room, and the strip of sky above the roofline, and what it had meant to be given 6 weeks of being a person, before being given the information about what she was carrying. She understood that gift more clearly now than when it was being given. Marin had understood that the knowing needed to come after the person was solid, not before. You could not be told what you were for, until you already knew what you were. She finished the tea. She thanked Peter. She went upstairs. The Covenant situation was developing. Ryland's lead from Claire had reached confirmation on the 4th week. A woman named Laura, merchant in the Eastern Territory, 20 years in the position, specific patterns of communication and travel, that when mapped against Claire's knowledge of the Covenant's operational structure, pointed clearly toward an organizational role above the field agent level. A second source had corroborated the first. The question was no longer whether Laura was what they believed she was, but what to do about it, in a way that closed the organization, rather than just removed a person from it. She and Rylan and Cale had been discussing this for 2 weeks, without arriving at the complete answer. She had been thinking about Isara's observation. An organization built to prevent a thing loses its purpose when the thing is present and turns out not to be what they feared. But losing purpose was not the same as ceasing to operate. Organizations without purpose often operated out of momentum long after the purpose that founded them was gone. She had also been thinking about Graham and Claire. Graham had not moved toward the position Claire had moved toward. His examination of the dissonance was slower, more defended. She had continued visiting both of them, and over the past 2 weeks the conversations had become more complex, which she read as progress rather than complication. The morning of the day after the signing ceremony, she went to the lower archive to work with Edmund. The deep first-age documents had been yielding steadily for 2 weeks, and what they contained was extending the archive's historical picture back further than any of the other sources had reached. She was finding, in these oldest records, accounts of the ley line network that predated the Ashvale bloodline's formal identification as its anchor, accounts that described the relationship from the perspective of the network itself. And this shift in perspective was clarifying things she had understood partially. The network, the oldest records suggested, was not passive. It did not simply receive the anchor function. It was in relationship with the bloodline that maintained it. It communicated, in the wordless way of deep things, and what Sarah had been experiencing as the Silver Forest, and the voice in the old language, was the network's side of that communication, reaching toward her, first through the suppression, and now with increasing clarity, as the suppression was fully gone. She understood the Silver Forest differently now. It was not a place but a form that the network's communication took when it needed to be understood in terms a person could hold, a metaphor generated by the relationship between her perceptual capacity and the network's attempt to bridge the gap between what it was and what she could receive. The trees were the ley lines made visible. The carved mark on the oldest tree was the original anchor point, the beginning of the relationship. She had been going there regularly now, in her sleep, not as a vision she could not control but as a choice, the way you return to a place you know well to think. The language was becoming more available to her, not as words but as understanding, and the understanding was cumulative, building on itself with each visit. She told Cale about this one evening when they were both in her room, he in the chair and she at the desk. "The network is explaining itself to you," he said. "Not in words," she said, "in understanding. The way you understand the weather by standing outside in it, not by being told about it." She paused. "Last week it directed me to a section of the Eastern Territorial Seam I had not been paying specific attention to. When I looked at the archive records for that section, they showed the highest recorded frequency of bond disruption in the Eastern Territory. I sent Edmund a note, and he sent the relevant material to the Eastern Territory's representative, and she told me that border zone has been in low friction for 60 years. He looked at her. "The network has been holding information about its own damage," she said, "and now it is providing it to me, in the order that is most useful for addressing it. The most damaged sections first." She paused. "I think that is what Adara meant when she wrote that it returns more fully itself. Both of them, the bloodline and the network. They have been separated for 300 years, and they are working out, together, how to function as what they were made to be. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the east window, the city was moving from gold to amber as the sun went down. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I have been reading Adara's letter," he said. "The translation Edmund made. I have read it several times." He paused. She describes the first keeper's experience of knowing what she was and what she was for, and the particular quality of that knowing, as something that could not be given or taught, only recognized, as something that was always present and needed the right conditions to become visible. He paused again. "I have been thinking about what conditions are required, what makes the recognition possible." She waited. "I think it requires someone showing you what recognition looks like," he said. "Someone who already knows, not teaching it, just being it, so that it is visible." He paused. "You do that. Every day in this building. People see it, and they recognize something. Not consciously, but it changes how they understand what knowing what you are looks like." She held his gaze for a moment. "Marin did that for me," she said. "She did not tell me anything important for 6 weeks. She just was what she was, in the most ordinary possible circumstances, completely. And watching that taught me something I could not have been told." He nodded slowly. "Get some sleep," she said. "The council session tomorrow starts early." He smiled at that, the real smile that appeared rarely and briefly, and was entirely different from the professional version. "I will," he said. He left. She wrote for another hour, and then set down the pen and looked at the dried lavender on the windowsill. Faded now, and past its fragrance, but still there. Still occupying its place on the windowsill, in the east-facing room, that had become, without her formally deciding it, the first home she had had since she left Ironmoon, with one bag, and the road south ahead of her. She looked at it for a while. Then she went to bed and slept, and the silver forest was there when she arrived in it, and she walked its pale paths, and the network spoke to her in the only language it had, and she listened, and she understood a little more than she had the day before. The 12 territories were in different stages of understanding, and she had been moving through them at different paces, adjusting to what each one needed, rather than providing the same thing to all of them. The northern territories were the fastest. Their relief at the ley line stabilization had been most palpable, the years of decline most directly felt in their pack bonds, and the restoration had arrived as a thing they recognized as restoration, rather than merely as a change they would need time to evaluate. Their alpha had come to the capital in the 4th week, a large-framed woman named Ada, who had the particular directness of someone who had spent years managing deteriorating circumstances and had developed no patience for anything other than the most efficient path forward. Ada had sat across from Sarah in the smaller meeting room on the 2nd floor and said, "Tell me what this is and what it requires." Sarah had told her, directly and completely, without the managed pace she used with the more cautious territories. Ada received it the way she received everything, by listening, without performing listening, and then asking the specific questions that would allow her to do something with the information. "The bond health in the northern border packs," Ada had said. "It has been getting worse for 20 years, in a way that we could not account for. Is that going to reverse?" "Gradually," Sarah had said. "The stabilization is not an event, it is a sustained presence. The recovery happens at the pace of a natural system recovering, not at the pace of a fix applied and completed." "Years," Ada had said. "Years," Sarah had confirmed. "The damage of 3 centuries does not reverse in a season. But the direction has changed. It will get better rather than worse. And it will keep getting better as long as the anchor function is maintained." "And you," Ada had said. "You are the anchor function. What happens to the network if something happens to you?" This was the question she had been expecting and had been thinking about carefully. "The network has memory," she said. "The stabilization we have already achieved does not vanish if I am absent temporarily. A prolonged absence would restart the erosion process, but not quickly. The work I am doing in the archive, the records I am building, the training I am beginning to develop for people who can monitor the network's health even without the bloodline's direct function, all of that is what reduces the dependency on any single person." Ada had looked at her. "You are building toward not being irreplaceable." "Yes," Sarah had said. "That is exactly what I am building toward." Ada had nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had received an answer that confirmed a good decision had been made. She thought about that conversation while writing the council report for the Northern Territory that would formalize the new communication structure between the palace and Ada's administration. The report was direct and specific and did not contain anything that was not accurate, which was her standard for all the formal documents that went out under her name. Edmund knocked on the open door. She looked up. "I have completed the translation of the personal journals from the Deep Archive," he said. "All 12 of them. I have indexed them chronologically, and by subject, and by the section of the anchor function they describe." He paused. "I would like to show you the index before I file the translations." She set down the pen. "Now," she said. "Yes." He came in and spread the index on the desk, and she looked at it with the attention she gave everything, reading the structure of what he had built, and finding it thorough and accurate and organized, with the specific care of a person who understood that what they were organizing was worth the care. "This is excellent," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, which was his version of "you are welcome," and gathered the index and went back downstairs. She looked at the space he had left on her desk for a moment. She thought about the 12 wolves who had written those journals. Different generations, different periods, different versions of the world they had been living in. All of them doing the work that was theirs to do, maintaining the network, staying present in the world, writing down what the experience was like for whoever came next. She was the whoever who came next. She was also writing for whoever came after her. The line continued. It had not ended, even in 3 centuries of apparent ending. It had waited, as Adara had said. And now it was running again, and what she was building would make sure the waiting, if it happened again, was shorter. She picked up the pen. She wrote. The morning Sarah signed the last of the formal documents that completed the structure of her council role was gray and still, and she marked it the way she marked most significant things, by going to the kitchen first. Peter made her tea without being asked, which he had been doing for 6 weeks, and which had happened by gradual accumulation rather than any specific decision, and which she thought of as one of the more accurate measures of how a place had decided about you. Not the formal statements, not the ceremonies. The tea, arriving before you asked for it, because someone had paid enough attention to know when you would want it. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to the building going about its morning. Dora was managing the breakfast preparation with the focused competence of someone who had always been good at her work and had recently found that the work was slightly more satisfying, though she would have struggled to say exactly why or when the change had occurred, because it had not announced itself, but had simply become the case. The junior kitchen staff moved between the stove and the cutting table in the well-established rhythm of people who knew each other's patterns. The morning supply delivery had arrived, and the reliable supplier was explaining something about the lavender quality to the person checking it in. The ordinary business of the building, large and complicated and continuous. She thought about the covenant situation, which was where most of her serious thinking was directed these days, because it was the piece of the larger problem that had not yet resolved. Ryland's second source on Laura had been confirmed a week ago. The organization's communication structure above the field agent level had been partially mapped from what Claire had provided. They had a picture now, incomplete but substantial, of how the upper layer operated, and who held what roles within it. Laura was one of 3 people at the organizational level above the field agent coordination. The other 2 were harder to see, their roles more thoroughly obscured by the cover identities they had maintained over decades. But they were there, and Claire's information pointed toward them even where it did not name them directly. The question remained what to do about it. She had been in conversation with Isara about this for 3 weeks, and the conversations had been valuable in a specific way. Isara understood the inside of institutions, how they maintained themselves, what held people to them over time, what made them vulnerable to change. The Covenant was not, structurally, very different from other long-standing organizations that had outlived the conditions that created them. What held the people in it now was not primarily the original ideology. It was the structure itself, the network of relationships and mutual obligation and shared identity that had grown up around the ideology over 2 centuries and which would persist even if the ideology shifted. The structure does not collapse because the purpose is gone, Isara had said in one of their recent meetings. It collapses when the people inside it can no longer see what holds them together. And what holds them together now, Sarah had said. The shared history, as Sarah had said, the sense of belonging to something that has persisted, the relationships between the people in it. She had paused, none of which requires an Ashvale bloodline to be absent. If the people in that organization can see what the bloodline actually is, rather than what they have been told it is, the thing holding them together does not have to be about preventing the bloodline's return. It could be about something else. Sarah had been thinking about this ever since. What the organization needed was not to be defeated or dismantled. It needed to be redirected, given a different purpose that could hold the same relationships and the same sense of shared history together. The Covenant had been operating for 2 centuries on the knowledge that they were protecting something. If what they had been protecting against turned out not to be what they thought, the knowledge itself could be redirected toward protecting something else. She did not yet know exactly what that looked like, but the direction was clearer than it had been. She finished her tea. She thanked Peter. She went upstairs. The council session was at 9. She arrived 5 minutes early, which was when she always arrived, and took her seat at the side of the room, and the council assembled around the table, and Cale opened the session, and the business of governing 12 territories went about its organized, complicated work. After the session, she spoke separately with Douglas and Petra, which had become a regular practice over the past weeks. The conversations had been evolving. Douglas had moved from cautious dissent to cautious engagement, his questions becoming more oriented toward understanding the practical implications of the structural change, and less oriented toward questioning whether the structural change was what was being described. Petra was in a slightly earlier stage of the same movement. She was patient with both of them. The patience was genuine, rather than performed, because she understood their concerns were real. The territories they represented had the most to navigate in the transition from the compensation structures back toward the natural function, and the transition required time and support and confidence that it was worth doing, and confidence of that kind was built by accumulation, not by argument. In the afternoon she went to the lower archive. Edmund was where he always was, surrounded by his notes and his catalogs, conducting the work that had become the professional achievement of his life, in a way that he was entirely serious about, and entirely unpretentious about simultaneously, which was one of the things she respected most about him. "There is something in the very last case," he said when she arrived. "The final documents. I believe they are personal records rather than administrative ones. I have not opened them yet. I wanted you here." She crossed to the final case. Edmund was right. The documents inside were different from everything else in the archive. They were not records or histories or formal accounts of function. They were personal. Letters, journals, the ordinary written material of people living their lives, and choosing to record some of what they thought and felt. They were written by Ashvale wolves across several generations. She and Edmund spent 3 hours with them. What she found in them was the thing Adara had described in the letter on the wall, but described now from the inside of specific lives, rather than in the formal terms of historical record. Wolf after wolf across the generations, writing about what it meant to be what they were, what the ley line connection felt like from the inside, what the anchor function required of daily life, how they understood their place in the world, and their relationship to the network that ran below it, and the packs that ran above it. The writing varied in style and in focus, and in the particular quality of each person's voice. Some were more systematic, approaching the experience intellectually. Others were more immediate, describing specific moments and what those moments felt like. One had written in the form of long observational passages about the behavior of the natural world around her, noting the ways the land responded to her presence that she had learned to read over years of paying attention. But across all of them, a common thread. The sense of being exactly where they were supposed to be. Not in a placid or uncomplicated sense. Several of the journals described difficulty, uncertainty, the challenge of carrying something significant in a world that did not understand what you were carrying. One had written at length about the loneliness of it, the particular loneliness of being responsible for something that was invisible to the people around you. Another had written about the work of explaining herself to people who had no framework for what she was describing. But beneath all of that, in all of them, the same thread. The sense of knowing what you were, and what you were for, the grounding of it. The particular solidity that came from being fully what you were in the world, rather than a partial or suppressed or hidden version of it. She sat in the archive room for a while after Edmund finished reading the last of them aloud. She thought about 22 years of the hidden version, of the wolf behind the closed door, of the faded mark and the broken shift and the particular way she had learned to make herself invisible in rooms where she was not wanted. She thought about what it had felt like to walk into Marin's shop and be hired in under a minute and be given 6 weeks of being a person, before being given the information that changed what that personhood had to carry. She thought about the laugh. She had understood the laugh better and better over the past weeks. It had been the sound of someone who was fully what they were, even before they knew what that was, even suppressed and hidden, and carrying a broken working instead of her real mark. Something in her had known, in the moment the bond formed and cracked, and the most powerful man in the world spoke those words in that silent hall, that she was more than the picture the moment was painting of her, and the laugh had been the sound of that knowing. Marin had been right. She had known who she was when she laughed. She had just not yet known everything that entailed. "Sarah," Edmund said. She looked at him. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I am." She looked around the archive room, at the shelves and the carved wall, and the warm quality the air in this room had maintained since the night the mark released here the first time. "I want to add these to the catalog," she said, "not as administrative records. Separately, as personal accounts, with full context for each one, who wrote it and when, and what was happening in the world when they wrote it." "I agree," he said. "I will start the indexing tomorrow." She went upstairs. She went to her room and sat at the desk and opened the document she had been writing for weeks, the practical account of the anchor function and the ley line network, and what the restoration meant in terms of what actually happened in the world, written in plain language for whoever came next. She wrote for 2 hours. The document was close to a completable state now, not finished, because she was still learning things every day that belonged in it, but close to the point where the structure was fully there, and the remaining additions were elaborations rather than foundations. Cale knocked at the usual time. She said, "Come in." He came in with his tea and sat in the chair, and did not ask what she was working on, because he had learned she would show him when it was ready, and not before, and he respected that, the same way she respected that there were things in the council work that he processed alone before discussing. She wrote for another 20 minutes and then set down the pen. "The personal journals," she said. He looked up. "Edmund found them today," she said. "In the last case, personal accounts written by Ashvale wolves across several generations. Not administrative records, just people writing about what it was like to live as what they were." He was quiet. "I want you to read them," she said. "When Edmund has the translations complete, I think it would be useful for you to read them." "Yes," he said. "I would like to." She looked at her right wrist, at the mark that was fully awake now, fully present, pulsing with its steady, even warmth. "I want to tell you something," she said, "that I have not said clearly yet." He waited. "I am staying here," she said, "not because the work requires it, though it does, not because there is nowhere else to go, though that is also true, because this is the first place I have been that felt like the right place, because the work is work I chose, because Edmund is in the archive every day, and Peter makes my tea without being asked, and Ruth reorganized the linen storage correctly for the first time in years, and Isara knows things that are worth knowing, and Fell has turned out to be someone you can work with." She paused. "And because the evenings are good." He looked at her. "The evenings are good," she said again, quietly, meaning it simply. "Yes," he said. "And whatever is between you and me," she said, "I want to allow it to become what it is, rather than being managed into a shape that is easier to describe. I do not have a precise word for it yet. I know it is real, and I know it has been building, and I know I am not interested in pretending it is not building." He was very still. "I know what I want," he said. "I have known for some time. I have been waiting for the right moment to say it. This is the right moment," she said. "I want what you want," he said, "all of it. The work, and the archive, and the territories, and whatever is between us, becoming what it is." He paused. "And I want to not be afraid of what it becomes. I was afraid, before. I made a choice from fear, and it cost more than I can calculate. I am not doing that again." She held his gaze. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." Outside the east window, the city was completely dark now, and lit from within. 10,000 windows in the night. all the accumulated ordinary activity of people going about their lives in a city that sat on top of ley lines that were steadily, week by week, more themselves than they had been in 3 centuries. The last of the Ashvale bloodline sat at a desk in a room that faced east and continued writing for the people who would come after her, and across from her the Alpha King sat in the lamplight and thought about what he had read and what he had heard and what was in front of him, and the evening settled around them both, and neither of them were afraid. In the morning there would be the council and the archive and the covenant situation and the 12 territories and all the enormous work of what came next, the work that would take years, the work that she had chosen. But the morning was not yet here. The city was lit, and the ley lines were warm, and the document was growing toward the point where the foundation would be complete, and what remained was the building on top of it. She turned the page. She wrote. Outside the east-facing window, above the lit city, the stars were out, the same stars that had been above the road south when she walked it 2 months ago, the same stars that had been above the oak tree where she slept the first night, the same stars that had been above Duskfield every evening when she sat at the back room window and watched the strip of sky above the roofline. The sky was not the same sky. She was not the same person. She was more fully herself than she had been before. That was what Adara had known. That was what all of them had known. Every wolf in every journal writing about knowing what you were and what you were for. The knowing changed you, not into something other than what you had been, into the full version of what you had always been. She wrote that down. She wrote, "The return does not restore what was. It completes what was always there. The difference between a locked door and an open one is not the door. It is whether the room can be used." She read that back. She left it. Outside, the first star above the horizon of the east-facing window was the same star it had always been, burning at its enormous distance, doing the work it had always done, present and certain and entirely itself. It was enough.